Hi, this is Jim Hawley, and welcome to the Motocross Vault.
Hello and welcome back to the Motocross Vault. My name is Tony Blazier, and what this video is going to cover is a look back at the history of Yamaha's iconic YZ250 two-strokes from its inception in 1974 through the current 26 model year. What I'm going to do is go over each model a little bit year by year, talk about what they changed. If there's something innovative or interesting that year, I'll mention it, talk a little bit about the performance of each one. Obviously, as we get closer to the current one, they haven't made nearly as many changes as they did in the early days. As the four-strokes kind of came online in the mid-2000s, the YZ250 did get relegated to the back a little bit in terms of innovations and updates, but Yamaha, to their credit, has kept making the machine, and they've kept doing updates, although maybe they're not as dramatic as they had been in the past. I love the fact that Yamaha stayed true to this two-stroke. I love two-strokes. They smell better, they sound better, they're awesome, they're less expensive to fix. Four-strokes have their place, certainly, but I think the two-stroke has its place as well. And I love the fact that Yamaha has stayed true to that and continued to build the machine. If you like this sort of thing, make sure you check out some of the other retrospectives I've done. I've done retrospectives on the history of the Yamaha's open bikes, Honda's open bikes, Suzuki's RM250, several other machines. You can find them on my channel here. If you like this sort of thing, make sure you check them out. If you could share this on social media, I would appreciate it as well. If you'd like to support what I do have Motocross Vault merch. I have Yamaha merch, Honda, Kawasaki, Suzuki, a little bit from every brand, as well as ATVs and off-road units as well. If you like something custom, let me know that. I'm happy to see if I can do something special for you as well. So here, without further ado, is a look back at the history of Yamaha's YZ250 two-strokes from 1974 through 2026. Our YZ250 story starts here in 1974 with the introduction of the very first YZ250A. Now, this machine is very different than the current YZ you'd see now, or pretty much what you probably think of when you think of a YZ250, which is kind of like the bread and butter mainstream 250 motocross machine for most of its life. But it started out as a very interesting and limited edition exotic machine. Currently, of course, you can buy quote-unquote works replicas or factory editions from manufacturers like KTM and Honda and Kawasaki, but they are really, mildly modified production machines. They're not a huge difference from what the average consumer normally could get. But here in 1974, Yamaha introduced a machine that really was almost like a factory bike. I wouldn't say it's for the masses, because this first edition is actually a limited edition machine. In 1974, Yamaha had the MX250, which was considered more of a mainstream machine for the average rider. And this YZ250 was designed to be only ridden by experts. Initially, you had to actually submit a resume to even get one. They were designed to be sold to local experts and pros, and the machine's price is pretty clearly aimed at not the average rider. In 1974, Cycle World showed the selling price for this YZ250 to be $1,836, which, of course, today doesn't sound like a lot, but in current money, that's almost $15,000. It was a very expensive machine. For comparison, in 1974, the Honda CR250M went for $1,145, which is, 40% less. A big difference. This YZ was super trick. Now, this very first version is unique in that it's the only YZ ever to have the dual shocks in the back. Here in 1974, the monoshock was still a year away, so this first version has what they call the thermal phase rear shocks, which have little reservoirs on them that allows the shocks, in theory, at least to cool better. The forks on the front are not a leading axle, they're in line, pretty common for the time. The YZ250 here has a CDI ignition. At the time, the Honda was using points, and the machine has reed valve induction, which is also an advantage Yamaha had, which basically gives the machine much more response than the old traditional piston port intakes of early two-strokes. This machine is very light. It is very trick in that the materials used is a really tough chromoly steel frame that was very high quality, much tougher than what you would have found on the MX line. Literally everything on the machine was dished out. All the bolts are dished out for lightness. The sprocket has little holes drilled in it for lightness. Even the seat bracket is drilled out like a works machine. If you look at this seat bracket, it looks like something that you'd find on a modern works bike. It's clear Yamaha took all this stuff very seriously with this machine. It was, again, very much designed for a pro to have, not a average Joe probably is not going to want to spend that kind of money on a machine like this. And the performance was geared more toward a skilled rider. The engine apparently was extremely fast from reading some of the tests of the time. But the power was very aggressive. It was hard hitting. I think probably most riders, unless they had the skill to handle it, probably wouldn't have gone any faster on this machine than they would have on an MX or a CR at the time. But if you were fast enough to use the performance it had, most of the magazines said it was a pretty significant advantage. It really was a no-compromise racer for serious buyers, and the first in a long line of high-performance 250 two-strokes from Yamaha. Here for 1975, you get one of the most important motocross machines probably ever produced, the 1975 YZ250B. The reason this is such a significant machine is the rear suspension system. This is the first year that Yamaha brought their works monoshock to the masses on the YZ and MX line, and it was an absolute revolution in technology at the time. In 74, the YZ's sturdy chromoly steel frame, powerful reed valve motor, and thermal phase shocks on their YZ250A were cutting edge for the time, but they were still not as trick as the works monoshock found on Håkan Andersson and Pierre Karsmaker's factory bikes. For 1975, Yamaha looked to rectify this trickness deficit with the all-new YZ250B. The new bike would once again offer a huge performance increase over the garden variety MX250 Yamaha, and perhaps more importantly, incorporate the radical new monoshock for the first time. The new YZ250B maintained the basic motor layout of the A model, but it did away with much of the peakiness of the previous year, with major porting changes aimed at beefing up its mid-range power. This had been a major complaint on the original 74 model, with even experts finding the 74 model a bit challenging to ride at times. There was a much broader power curve on the B model, and this helped its appeal on the track. The transmission and much of the running gear was maintained from 74, and the new bike shouldered on with the mediocre forks found in the 74 model. Of course, the biggest change on the 75 was the new monoshock in the rear, which required an all-new frame to accommodate its large and long shock used for the damping. The shock itself ran the length of the chassis and sat nestled under the seat and tank. This laid-down position was the key to the mono suspension advantage, and it gave the bike roughly twice the travel of most machines at the time. The downside of this new design, however, was its weight. The beefed-up frame, oversized shock, and assorted hardware needed for the monoshock bloated the weight of the YZ nearly 20 pounds over the 74 model. Here in America, the new monoshock YZ was yellow and black, which was in line with what they were running on the works bike side here in America, but most of the other countries around the world got the white and red, which Yamaha considered to be its international colors at the time. Both machines are identical other than the color. On the track, the new YZ was a huge step forward in performance, in spite of its significant weight gain. The revamped power plant was much less demanding and easier to go fast on. On the dyno, peak horsepower was down to almost 2 horsepower, but the mid-range was much improved. Low-end was still virtually non-existent on the YZ. With its extremely light flywheel and hard hit, the bike continued to be aimed at experts only. The new monoshock was a bit stiff and prone to kicking if you backed off the throttle, but for fast guys it was an absolute revelation. Travel was massive for the time at 6.3 inches, and obstacles could be attacked as never before. The forks were largely a carryover, as I said, and they were the weakest link in the overall package. Based on the units found on the DTMX line, they were far from state-of-the-art and incapable of handling the speeds the motor and shock were capable of generating. For most experts, an upgrade of the forks, internals, or a complete swap to a set of aftermarket units was mandatory. Handling was once again aimed at experts, and the bike demanded aggression to work properly. If ridden hard, the YZ handled well, but if you backed it off, the rear end would kick and send way too much force to the woefully undersized forks. The turning of the machine also demanded aggression, and the bike tended to stand up in turns if the rider was not 100% committed. Braking was a carryover from the year before, and it continued to be excellent. The front could be locked up with a firm grip, and the rear was very powerful, if a bit touchy. Overall, the new YZ250B was a huge technological achievement, but it was not perfect. In keeping with its premium standing within the Yamaha lineup, the YZ250B came in at $1,850, which was roughly $600 more than an MX250 would have set you back that year. The bike, of course, did offer a lot for that money, but once again, it was a pro-oriented machine aimed at an expert rider, not really the best choice probably if you were not capable of handling all the performance it offered. Here for 1976, we get the revamped Yamaha YZ250C. This machine, as you can see visually, doesn't bear a whole lot of resemblance to the previous year's YZ because actually the bike is not a YZ at all, really. It's really an updated version of the MX in 250. They have the same tank, same basic styling. Here for 1976, Yamaha decided that they no longer wanted to split the line into a bike for the everyman and a bike for pros. They combined them too, so the MX250 goes away and it becomes the quote-unquote YZ now, and the exotic machine that was available in 74 and 75 is no longer available. This machine is much more of a revamped MX than really anything in common with the previous YZ. This new YZ gets the yellow color scheme, so I guess in that way it is visually similar to the previous year, but as you can see, it doesn't have the exotic strap-on alloy tank, and the lightweight materials is not found in this machine like it was in the previous year. This YZ for 1976 does get some important improvements, however. They added an all-new fork system here in 76. It is an air fork. Now, air forks obviously have been fairly controversial over the last 10 years or so. Motocross has been kind of flirting with air forks here for a while, and this is a very early version of it, really. In 1976, a lot of you probably didn't realize they had this technology then, but there's no spring in these forks. It uses two separate air chambers to handle the fork duties, and actually most people at the time say it actually worked pretty well, much better than the previous forks, which were pretty mediocre in 74 and 75. The main issue with these forks is they're fairly complicated to sort out, which is still the problem with air forks. There's a lot to adjust, also a lot to get wrong. They also updated the porting this year, made it a little wider in terms of the power band itself. It has a very wide and smooth power band. I think most people in the tests I've read really like this motor. It was much easier to ride than the previous YZ, which again was much more pro-oriented. This is again an MX bike, really. It's not really a YZ, so it's not really targeted at the same market the previous one was. This is more of a bike that was compete with the Honda CRs and the new RM. Now this year you do get the RM250 added into the mix, and that bike is the first machine from Suzuki to offer long travel suspension in the 250 class, and it really is the main competitor here to the YZ this year. The Honda at the time was still a step behind. It did not have a reed valve. It had short travel suspension in the back. It was kind of falling behind. In 74, it was a game-changing machine, a really great motorcycle, but quickly technology was changing. The Yamaha had the long travel suspension. Now Suzuki had long travel suspension, and Honda was kind of falling behind. The price this year is much more in line with what the other machines are going for. The price drops about $600 from the original YZ, so it's much more affordable to the everyman. The two shootouts I read here in 76 were kind of split on whether they liked the YZ or the RM better. I think most of the people probably in hindsight say the RM was probably a better bike, but the YZ was pretty close this year. The main knock on the YZ was it's very heavy. It is, in the test it shows the machine is about 15, 16 pounds heavier than the RM. It's actually quite portly. It's almost 240 pounds, which is a heavy bike for the time, and you consider it didn't have liquid cooling and power valves or all the other stuff they get later. And that was kind of the main knock on the machine. It had good performance, but a lot of the magazine testers complained that the machine was pretty heavy. The suspension that was updated, as I said, in the front with the new air forks, and in the rear, they made some adjustments here to make the suspension a little less stiff. The YZ, the works quote-unquote version YZ, had very stiff rear shock. It was really, unless you were really fast, it didn't work very well. A lot of people complained that it was way too stiff. And this new MX/YZ version is tuned more for average riders, and it's softer in its action, a little bit easier to use. Wasn't quite as likely to bite you if you backed off the throttle. I think overall most people think this is an update that made sense. They weren't going to sell a whole lot of the YZs, very limited production machine, and by kind of making it more of a mainstream product here in 76, it simplified their lineup and brought probably more people into the Yamaha fold. All right, here for 1977 we have the all-new YZ250D. This is a complete redesign of the YZ platform. It's an all-new machine from the ground up. You have a new frame, redesigned suspension, a new motor, and all-new bodywork. Other than color, the bike doesn't bear really any resemblance to the 76 model. It is a complete redesign from the ground up. This year they retired the air forks. They were a one-year option, actually, and I don't think Yamaha's ever used air forks since, even though some other manufacturers have. I'm not sure exactly why they retired them so quickly. None of the magazines seem to be clear, other than Yamaha saying they thought the new forks were better. I'm not sure if there were issues with them as far as maintenance goes, or just they were just difficult for people to sort out. I don't really know. I've never ridden them myself, but they were a weird little quirk here in 70s history. Here for 77, you get all new forks with longer travel. They moved from a inline axle to a leading axle design, which the manufacturers were finding would provide better handling. It also increases travel. In 1976, the front travel on the air forks was 8.5 inches. Here for 1977, you get the all-new Kiaba Air Spring Fork with a full 9.8 inches of travel. In the rear, the monoshock is redesigned. It moves away from that large bulbous reservoir that it had to a new decarbon type that's all-inclusive of the shock itself. It doesn't have a remote reservoir. That, of course, would prove, I guess it saved them a little space, but it would prove problematic as far as fade goes. But in any case, they redesigned the shock here. It still runs up the center line of the frame as the previous design had, but it does have longer travel here for 77. The shock went from 7 inches in 76 to a full 9.6 inches here in 1977. The motor is still an air-cooled design with the reed valve. The displacement stayed the same at 246 cc's, but due to get a smaller carburetor, it moved from a 38mm Mikuni to a 36mm Mikuni, and they did that to increase low to mid power. The chassis, as I said, is completely redesigned. You have an all-new frame to accommodate the redesigned suspension. You have all-new bodywork. You went away from a metal tank here for the first time in 77. You get the kind of plastic tank. I know when I think of YZs of this era, this is kind of the design I think of here, the Bob Hanna style YZ250s. It's a good-looking machine, in my opinion. It seems like most of the testers thought it was a very good machine in terms of performance. The new engine was easier to ride, and the chassis handled much better. The early monoshocks, as I said earlier, were kind of notorious for kicking, particularly if you let off the throttle. They would get unsettled in turns, and they could be kind of vicious handlers at times. And here in 77, they made a lot of changes to make the bike a little easier to ride. And it seems like the kicking was much less prominent. The suspension worked better. The bike no longer had that kind of strange yam hop as prominent. I think all these early Yamahas, because of the design of the shock, they still suffered from that a little bit. It was kind of something that really didn't get away from until the mid-80s when they went to the linkage suspensions. But the 77 model here is improved in terms of handling. Most of the magazines say it's a much better handler than the previous design. The weight is also down significantly. This machine clocked in at a claimed 229 pounds, which is 10 pounds lighter than the 76 model. So it's a big improvement in terms of that. I'm sure that played some dividends in the handling as well. So the bike had better handling, improved ergonomics, improved suspension, and lighter weight here for 77. It's a significant upgrade in pretty much every respect and made the YZ even more competitive in the very, very competitive 250 class here of 77. Here for 1978, we get the revamped YZ250E. This machine looks very similar to the outgoing 77 model, but in truth, it's all new from the ground up. This year, we get significant updates to the frame, suspension, and motor in order to provide even better performance on the track. In truth, about the only thing that was unchanged for 1978 was the bodywork, which was largely a carryover from the year before. In redesigning the YZ250 for 78, one of the major goals for the Yamaha engineering team was to improve its handling. While some of the bike's handling peccadillos were not going to be easily eliminated without a total redesign of the monocross rear suspension, Yamaha reasoned that most of them could be mitigated by beefing up the existing design. In order to accomplish this, Yamaha spec'd an all-new frame for the YZ250E. The new chassis maintained the same basic configuration as 77, but added strength and trimmed weight for 78. To accomplish this, they upgraded the frame from the heavy and flexy carbon steel used in 76 and 77 to lighter and stronger chromoly steel. By switching to the new tougher steel, the engineers were able to reduce the wall thickness of the frame by 0.2 millimeters across the board and knock a full 5 pounds off the weight of the chassis for 78. Paired with the new chromoly frame was a redesigned swing arm for the monocross rear suspension. In 1977, one of the hot setups had been to swap the flimsy steel stock swing arm for a beefy alloy unit. For 1978, Yamaha made this upgrade standard equipment by bolting on a Sano unit that looked to have been taken directly off Bob Hanna's Works Racer. The new design maintained the triangular configuration in use in 75, but swapped out the flexy mild steel unit for ultra-rigid aluminum. With big welds and massive tubes, the new swing arm was far less prone to flex than the old design, and combined with the new frame, went a long way towards sorting the Yamaha's unruly rear-end habits. In the motor department, Yamaha went all out towards upping their performance in 78. An all-new motor was spec'd that both increased power and saved weight. The new design maintained the internal dimensions of 77, but shared little else with the old design. The new mill was lighter, shorter, and slimmer, offering a lower profile and a 2-pound weight savings. In an effort to reduce chain-related issues, the countershaft was also moved 15 millimeters closer to the swing arm pivot to reduce the reliance on chain tensioners and help prevent derailment caused by the bike's extreme suspension travel. The new cylinder retained the air cooling and overall displacement of 77, but did offer more aggressive porting specs. The new head was also reshaped to offer cleaner burn, and a new 2-ring piston, up from a single ring used in 77, was slipped in for increased durability. On the intake side, Yamaha retained the torque reed induction system it had used in 72, but added a 10mm larger reed valve and a 2mm larger Mikuni carburetor to increase flow. Finishing off the motor package was an all-new 6-speed transmission, which was up from 5 speeds used in 77, a hotter ignition, and a revised exhaust that offered better sealing, with 2 sealing rings at the header instead of just 1 for increased performance. On the suspension front, Yamaha chose to refine rather than completely redesign the machine for 78. The new YZ250E retained the same basic suspension layout as the D model, but made several important changes to improve performance. Up front, a set of 38mm Kayaba forks offered 9.8 inches of travel to go with its air oil adjustability. While the air could be added or subtracted via a Schrader valve to fine-tune its performance, there was no external adjustment for damping. For 1978, the only major change to the forks was an additional 20mm of internal fork overlap. This small change was made to lessen binding in the fork under extreme loads and prevent the forks from locking when topped out. Out back, Yamaha spec'd an all-new damper to go with its works-style alloy swing arm. The revised shock maintained the decarbon design it used in 77, but added a new super slick coating to the bushings and an extra 4mm of shaft travel. Adjustability remained an advantage of the Yamaha damper, and the new YZ250 offered 13 available settings for damping control to go with its 9.8 inches of overall travel. On the track, the YZ250E turned out to be a significant advantage in some ways and a step back in others. The new machine was lighter, faster, and better suspended, but the new power band proved more demanding on the track. It had higher overall horsepower figures, but the motor's power band was less forgiving and more demanding. The YZ's hard-hitting motor and unique chassis were lethal to the competition in the right hands, but it took a certain amount of skill to extract that performance. If you're up to the challenge, the bike was capable of winning a national in near-stock condition, but if you were more mortal, some of the other machines in the class might have been a better choice in 1978. Here in 1979, we get another fairly significant update to the YZ lineup with the all-new YZ250F. Now, this machine is, in my opinion, probably the best looking of the 70s 250s. I love this design. Again, this is the kind of the Bob Hanna era, and this is just a cool looking motorcycle in my opinion. Visually, the main thing you're going to notice this year is the move to the FIM mandated side plates that move the number plates back a little bit, I guess, to make them easier to read. I never was a big fan of the earlier design with the plates up kind of being blocked by your legs. And of course, this is a more modern thing. Probably, I guess I was probably 9 when this bike came out, and that was kind of like what I thought of a YZ should look like. And this is just a great looking motorcycle in my opinion. The plastic design, other than the side plates, is basically the same as the year before, although Yamaha did increase the thickness of the plastic slightly. I think from reading some of the tests at the time, some people had complained that the fenders would kind of droop when they got loaded down with mud and stuff, so they made them a little stronger here in 1979, but visually they look very similar. Chassis-wise, you get an all-new frame here in 1979. One of the problems with these early long-travel suspension systems was there was a lot of variance in the chain tautness as the bike went through its travel. Starting, I think, in 76, Yamaha had added a chain tensioner, or maybe 77. They'd added a chain tensioner to try and help with this problem, but they were finding the real solution was to move the swing arm pivot closer to the countershaft sprocket. It took a while to figure this out, but every year the manufacturers were moving a little closer, and here in 79 they moved the countershaft and the swing arm pivot closer together, and that would provide a little less variance in the chain tension as it went through its travel. The frame has new geometry here in 1979 as well. They moved back the steering head angle 1.5 degrees in an effort to make the machine handle a little better in the turns. The suspension travel is up here for 79. It moved up to a full 10.6 inches front and rear. The shock in the back is actually shorter. Overall length of the shock itself, but travels up a little bit through a redesign of the swing arm and the mounting. The motor itself is basically the same engine as in 78. It's still a 6-speed transmission, which is a rarity in the 250 class. I don't know too many 250s either back then or modern day that use a 6-speed transmission. But the 6-speed here in 79 has new porting, and from what the test said, it was a little easier to ride. The power band was more torquey. The 78 model had been very fast, but it was abrupt. There wasn't a lot of low-end torque. It came on really hard in the mid-range and pulled really strong on top, but it was a little difficult to ride. And here for 1979, they made some changes to make that power band a little wider, a little easier to use. And it seems like most of the magazines say it was an improvement in terms of rideability. They also smoothed out the gearbox a little bit. While it still wasn't great, these Yamaha gearboxes are notoriously notchy, but they did make some improvements here for 79 to try and make it a little better. They also fixed some problems with the pipe. The pipe mounting and the pipe itself were known for cracking in this era, and they made some changes to try and improve the reliability as far as that goes as well for 1979. Overall, this bike is very competitive. If you look at the suspension travel, even at 10.6 inches, it's like more than an inch less than what Honda was putting out with their Elsinore at the time. In 78, Honda had completely revamped their Elsinore lineup, and the machine had almost a foot of travel, I think, at the time. I had a 78 CR250. It was an awesomely fast machine. But I think in these early days of the long suspension travel, they hadn't figured out that the forks were probably a little spindly for that amount of travel. They were very flexy and what have you. And a lot of people actually think the shorter travel on the Yamaha actually worked better than some of the longer travel units available at the time. This fork worked very well here in 1979, and a lot of the magazines seem to have rated it as the best fork available. This shock was rated well. It worked well in terms of performance, although some people still had an issue with the Yamaha. As I said earlier, that kind of quirky handling never completely went away until they got away from this original design. One interesting point here is in 1979 that this bike costs over $1,800. It's basically the same cost that the super exotic 74 machine had cost 5 years earlier. Of course, 5 years adjusted for inflation is not as big of a difference, but the bike is definitely going up in cost. You figure it's gone up $600. Overall, though, it seems like most of the magazines said this 79 was a really competitive machine, and for my money, certainly one of the best looking machines in the 1970s by a wide margin. For 1980, we get the YZ250G. It's pretty amazing when you look back at these old machines, how quickly they were being revamped. Pretty much every year you were getting an all-new machine, or certainly a major update in one area or another. Here in 1980, you get a significant upgrade in pretty much every way on the YZ250. Visually, the machine does look similar. The bodywork is similar, at least in appearance, but it's actually all new. Every piece of plastic on the bike is redesigned here for 1980. The tank is not interchangeable, even though it looks, again, visually similar. They redesigned all the fenders. The plastic is lighter after making it a little thicker the year before, but they redesigned it to be wider and provide a little bit of roost protection. They kind of streamlined that really nice looking side plate here on the machine, and the seat is all new as well. For 1980, you get a redesign of the monoshock as well. Although the basic configuration remained very similar, nearly everything else about it was all new. The new design retained the lay-down arrangement and large triangulated swing arm used in 79, but added an all-new shock that was lighter and more compact than before. The new damper was crafted from aluminum to save weight and featured a remote reservoir for the first time. This was a tried-and-true trick of the aftermarket, and this reservoir increased the overall oil capacity of the shock and improved fade resistance by placing the canister on the frame down tube where it could get lots of cooling air. By offloading some of the oil capacity of the remote reservoir, Yamaha was able to reduce the overall length of the shock significantly. This allowed them to further improve cooling by moving the shock out of the frame main backbone and mounting it directly to the frame. Because the shock was shorter, it was also placed slightly lower on the frame for improved handling. To further reduce the top-heavy feel, Yamaha inverted the shock to place the spring at the bottom and installed a tapered spring to save a few ounces. As a side benefit, this also made for easier tuning and allowed the preload and damping adjustments to be made to the shock without removing it from the chassis. In order to accommodate the new rear suspension, Yamaha had to dial up an all-new frame for 1980. The new chromoly steel frame deleted the double cradle used in 1979 and replaced it with a large single down tube to increase strength and reduce flex. Without the need to house the shock, the frame's backbone was smaller in diameter and made of larger and thicker tubing. This helped address one of the weak points of the 77 through 79 frames, which had suffered from cracks in this area. Overall, the new frame was lighter, stronger, and more compact, and tuned to improve steering response over the 79 model. On the motor side of things, the YZ250G's 246cc power plant was just as all new as the rest of the machine. While the bore and stroke remained unchanged from the year before, the rest of the motor was completely a new design. The new cases on the G model were far smaller than the F had been, and it gave the mill an almost 125-like appearance. Inside that shrunken bottom end, a new transmission housed 6 speeds, and a new shift drum was added to improve shifting action. In the top end, the G used a lightweight aluminum cylinder with a cast-in steel liner and a 2-ring piston. Internal porting was new for 1980, with a repositioned exhaust port to accommodate the switch to a single down tube, and a freer breathing reed valve. The reed material remained stainless steel, but it opened 3 mm farther for 1980 to increase the flow from the 38 mm Mikuni mixer. Finishing off the power package were an all-new airbox, a redesigned pipe, and a large, non-rebuildable steel silencer. In terms of performance, the 1980 YZ250G turned out to be a significant upgrade over the F model in most respects. The new chassis was nimbler and felt lighter than any YZ since the Featherlight original in 1974. Turning was much improved over the 79 model, and the bike tracked straight in the rough as long as you kept the power on. If you backed off, the G model would still exhibit the occasional Yamaha swap, but it was far less frequent than in the past. Overall, most testers felt that the YZ250G offered the best handling package in the 250 class in 1980. On the motor front, the new YZ offered a much more potent power package than in 79. The new G motor lacked the solid low-end torque of the YZ250F, but it made up for it with a strong mid-range and blistering top-end pull. Off the line, it was purely pedestrian, but once it climbed on the pipe, it waved bye-bye to every other bike in the class. Because of its lack of torque and abrupt hit, it was tricky to keep on the pipe, and far more demanding to ride than the mellower 79 model had been. Out of corners, the front end of the YZ tended to get very light, and if you whacked up in the throttle suddenly, the potent mid-range blast was likely to put you on your backside. This made the bike a bit of a handful for novices, but a potent weapon for those with the skill to make the most of its awesome hit. On the suspension end of things, the new G model offered an impressive 11.8 inches of travel from its 38mm Kiaba forks. This was an increase of over an inch from the 1979 model. The new forks offered no external adjustments for compression or rebound, but they did offer some fine-tuning through air pressure as a supplement to the springs. If you actually wanted to adjust the forks to damping, the only option was to change the volume and viscosity of the oil. Out back, the new monoshock offered the same 11.8 inches of travel as the front forks. This was over an inch more than in 1979. External adjustments were limited to spring preload and a 24-position rebound clicker at the base of the shock. Compression damping was set and cannot be altered without changing the shock's internals. On the track, the YZ250G suspension proved some of the best in the business. Both ends were plush, with excellent control and good bottoming resistance. By modern standards, both ends were incredibly soft, but by the standards of the time, they were more than adequate for racing anywhere below the Pro class. As long as you kept the power on, the new mono tracked straight and true, gobbling up whoops and stutters easily. With its new remote reservoir, fading was much improved, and the shock maintained consistent damping for far longer than in the past. Pros, of course, were likely to opt for a Fox, White Brothers, or Luff shock, but for average Joes, it was an excellent damper. In the end, the 1980 YZ250G stands as the high watermark of the original monoshock YZs, the culmination of half a decade of refinement and innovation. With the coming arrival of linkages and rising rate rears, its days were numbered, but in 1980 it still had what it took to propel the YZ to the top. With a powerful pro-oriented motor, sharp turning, and superb suspension, the YZ250G was the class of the field in 1980, and a fitting way to finish off a decade of Yamaha excellence in the 250 class. Here for 1981, we get the last of the original monocross Yamaha YZ250s, the YZ250H. This is still a competitive machine, but technology was quickly changing in the 250 class. Here in 81, you get a massive influx of updates on the Honda CR250R and Suzuki's RM250X. This year, they both moved to single-shock rear suspensions with rising rate linkages. In the terms of Honda, they added their Pro Link for the first time to the rear of the CR, and Suzuki added their iconic full floater to the RM250. Kawasaki was already using a version of a single shock rear suspension, the Unitrack, so this left Yamaha as the only manufacturer still without a linkage in the 250 division. In the case of the Honda, they also added liquid cooling here in 1981, so it's a pretty significant influx of technology here, and the Yamaha, while still a very competitive machine, is by far the most old school of the big four. Here for 1981, the YZ250 does get some important updates. The most significant is probably the new forks up front, which moved from 38mm to 43mm. Now, this is the size that most full-size motocross machines would use throughout the 80s. It was a significant improvement in terms of flex. At the time, most of the riders thought 38s were fine. They were considered beefy for their time. But when you started riding a newer machine with the 43s, you noticed a lot more flex on the old design. And this made the front end a little more precise, less likely to deflect on hard hits. It was definitely an improvement in terms of technology on the front end, although it seems like from the magazine tests, the performance wasn't a whole lot better in terms of damping, but it did offer a more precise front end. In addition to the new forks, the YZ250 gets a couple of motor updates. The most significant of those is probably the move back to a 5-speed transmission. Apparently there were some transmission issues on the 6-speed, and Yamaha decided that what they were going to do is put 5-speed back in it and beef up the transmission. Yamaha claims the new transmission here for 81 is 40% stronger than the old one. It seems like Dirt Bike and Motocross Action, they said they never had any failures on theirs, but some were reported, so I guess Yamaha made this change for reliability reasons. The motor itself is very similar other than the transmission. The other change of note with the YZ250 for 1981 is the introduction of the Yamaha Energy Induction System, the YEIS, which is colloquially known as a boost bottle. This was a popular aftermarket upgrade in the late 70s. What it would do is put a little storage chamber, like an empty cylinder, connected to the intake that would allow any unused fuel or air to be in reserve for the engine, so you wouldn't have like the engine starve for fuel or air. It was designed to improve bottom end performance. It really had no advantage at top end. It was really just to give the motor a little more fuel and air if it needed it at low end. Yamaha, as far as I know, is the only OEM to actually put these on the bikes as standard equipment. I don't think any of the other manufacturers did it, but like I said, it was a very popular aftermarket upgrade. If you look at the YZ490, used it up until, I guess, 90 when it was finally retired. Yamaha's Blaster had it. Some of the Yamaha's bikes in the 80s had this. I would assume it's more of a gimmick if nobody else went with it, but it was added here for 81, and Yamaha was very proud of this technological update. In terms of performance, though, the YZ250 was still a very competitive machine, but like I said, the technology was moving so fast in the 250 division that it was falling behind machines like the new RM250X, which, with its more advanced rear suspension, pretty much laid waste to the class this year. Even though its motor was not awe-inspiring, the suspension was so much better than the others that the RM250 was the machine to have here in 1981. The YZ250 was certainly capable of winning here in 1981, but with technology moving so quickly, Yamaha knew they were going to have to add some significant updates to the YZ250 pretty quickly. After a year of fairly minor updates, the YZ250 was back for 1982 with the YZ250J model, an all-new design from the ground up. This is a tremendous update in terms of technology. Pretty much everything on the machine was updated here for 82. This is the first year that Yamaha went to liquid cooling on their YZ250. Now this is interesting in that at the time in the early 80s, all the manufacturers had very different ideas on where the radiator should go. Yamaha, going back to, I guess, maybe 76, had used this radiator up on the forks thing with their works bikes. This was a fairly complicated solution. I'm not sure why they went with this, maybe because they thought it would get a lot of air up there high, but it required them to route some of the coolant through the steering head, which over time would lead to leaks. It also gave the machine kind of a top-heavy feel because you could actually feel the weight of that radiator up at the handlebars when you rode the bike back-to-back with other machines. But it is the first year, so they're still kind of working out the kinks here. The motor itself is all new. In addition to being liquid-cooled, it is the first production machine to use a power valve. This Yamaha power valve system used a rotating drum to cover or uncover part of the exhaust port, varying the exhaust port timing, and in theory would give the machine a broader power band. Basically, at low RPMs, you could optimize the porting for low-end torque. When you wanted the machine to rev a little better, it would rotate and uncover part of the exhaust valve, allowing for increased exhaust flow and, in theory, more top-end power. This is, as I said, the first year for this design, and Yamaha would use this basic power valve system really up until the late 90s. At one point, they would add an exhaust resonance chamber, but this basic sliding drum design would be the backbone of their 250 motocross designs for well over a decade. In addition to the all-new motor here in 1982, you get a redesigned chassis. Interestingly, they did want to add a rising rate linkage to the machine, but they didn't want to completely redesign how they were doing rear suspension. So they have a weird little hybrid system which uses the same shock placement of the earlier monocrosses with the shock laid down, kind of running down the backbone of the chassis, but they added a linkage to the bottom of it. I don't think by most estimations this was a particularly effective design. It's kind of a band-aid to try and not have to redo everything, but it does add a linkage here in 1982. Up front, they also added a dual leading shoe here in 1982 to the front brake. What that did was, instead of activating the shoes from just one side, it basically pushed on the brake shoes from both sides, increased the power. This was by far the most powerful of the drum brakes. Yamaha and Honda were both going to the dual leading shoe at the time, and it was definitely an improvement. It still was not as powerful as the disc you found on Kawasaki's KX250 here in 1982, which was at the cutting edge of braking performance, but it was an improvement over the 81 design in terms of braking force and feel. In terms of performance here in 1982, even though it's the most technologically advanced machine, it's not the best 250. Once again, the Yamaha bugaboo of weight reared its head. This new design, when they added all that extra stuff to the bike, it raised the weight from the 81 machine over 20 pounds. It was a portly machine. In 1982, it was by far the heaviest 250 out there, and I think that and the placement of that weight with that radiator up on the front hindered the YZ's handling. The motor did offer a very wide power band. It was not the fastest machine. Here in 82, the RM250 was kind of the king of the horsepower division in 82, but the YZ offered a very wide and usable power band. The motor was not the real problem, though. I think it was the chassis that was really the hindrance of the YZ250. But it is, again, very, very forward-thinking in a lot of ways. If you look at the chassis itself, it's the only machine to offer a seat that goes all the way up the tank. The quote-unquote safety seat of the time. This was a real nice feature. It kept you from racking your family jewels when you slid forward. The machine certainly looks very advanced. It's a spacey-looking, good-looking bike, but I think they still needed to work some of the kinks out of the design before it was able to run with the best machines in the class. After a year full of innovation but fairly subpar results on the track, Yamaha was back for 1983 with another all-new design. The YZ250K was once again redesigned from the ground up. There's really nothing that's much of a carryover from the year before. Pretty crazy when you see that they're redesigning these machines literally every year. It's hard to imagine anybody doing that today, but certainly in the early 80s, all the manufacturers were throwing the kitchen sink at these motocross machines every year. For 83, you get an all-new chassis with a redesigned motocross rear end. The motor is similar in design to the 82 model. It maintains the Yamaha power valve system liquid cooling. It does have a all-new configuration internally, though. They rejiggered the bore and stroke and also offered an all-new porting profile here for 1983. This year, they also moved to a more conventional radiator placement, moving the radiator from up on the handlebars, where everybody was complaining about it affecting handling and causing some reliability issues. This year, they moved it to the frame to a dual radiator setup similar to what Honda was using at the time. The chassis and rear suspension is all new swing arm, new linkage. It was designed to be more progressive, they said here for 1983. You get new bodywork. It's a good-looking motorcycle, I think. Some people complain that the tank shape was actually worse than 82. It kind of comes up more abruptly up at the front, and the saddle makes it hard to slide forward, but that was done obviously to accommodate the radiators somewhat. The tank is a little bit smaller in terms of overall capacity here for 83, but I think most of the magazines seem to think the ergonomics actually were better in 82, interestingly. One nice thing about this bike is it does have the lowest seat height of all the new motocrossers here in 83. Some people did complain it was a little harder to slide forward and back, kind of trapped in a little pocket there. But if you were short, it was easier to reach the ground. So a little bit of a trade-off here in 83 as far as that goes. The motor in 83 is an absolute rocket. It is the fastest 250 in the class. It is the widest power band. The power valve certainly starting to show the advantages of that design. The motor is excellent overall and rated probably the best motor in the class in 83, but the rest of the chassis was still a little bit of a step behind. Suzuki still ruled the roost in terms of the rear suspension action with their full floater rear end, and Honda seemed to take the class by storm with a maybe not as fast or as well suspended as some of the others, but it seemed to cover all the bases in a way that made it the best overall in most of the magazine shootouts at the time. This 83, though, is a much improved machine. The weight comes down significantly here in 83. They shaved nearly 20 pounds off the chassis. Big improvements. Like I said, the 82 model, maybe the single biggest problem it had was how portly it was. It was, almost the same weight as like a YZ400F. It was a really heavy machine. And this 83 is a much lighter bike, more in line with what the other machines were doing at the time. So overall, this 83, certainly not a world beater, but much improved in most every respect. Here for 1984, we get another all-new machine in the form of the 1984 YZ250L. Yamaha revamped the machine quite extensively this year with motor, chassis, and suspension updates front to back. The probably most dramatic difference is the new bodywork, which has a similar look to 1983, but you have a new tank with a slightly smaller capacity, a little less bulbous. A lot of people complained in 83 that the tank was too wide, kind of felt like a desert tank. And for 84, you have a little slimmer ergonomic package as far as the tank seat juncture. You also have all new radiator shrouds that are yellow instead of black. I actually think that looks much better in my opinion. They revamped the motor quite extensively this year. The engine again still uses the Yamaha power valve system, that sliding drum, but they revamped it with all new porting, including an additional port in the intake track and some all-new subports for the Yamaha power valve system. The motor has a all-new exhaust pipe this year, and it actually runs to the right instead of the left, so they switch sides with that. The engine gets an all-new airbox this year, which has 3 times the volume of the 1983 model, and as a bonus, it's actually side accessible, so you don't have to take the seat off to get to the airbox. Makes it a lot easier to get to the air cleaner for 1984. The suspension is new this year. The forks have the availability of compression adjusting, which is a nice little thing. Before they were not adjustable, so for 1984 you can actually adjust the compression damping. There still is no adjustment for rebound control here in 1984. The forks remain remain 43 millimeters in diameter, but there is a 10 millimeter shorter stanchion than on the previous year, although the overall length of travel stays the same. In the rear, the shock is slightly shorter with a new leverage ratio to save weight, and there's altered damping and valving in the rear end. The shock has both compression and rebound damping adjusters here in 1984. One interesting thing to note on the chassis was the all-new wheels here in 1984. Yamaha had gone with their own design they called Z-spokes here in 1984. Instead of using two spokes connected at the center hub, it uses a single long spoke that snakes through the hub itself. The problem with this was they tended to get loose and break hubs. They were notorious for snapping at the little tab there where the Z-spoke goes to the hub. These turned out to be pretty problematic and were a known failure point here in this era of YZ. Another thing that's of note is the Yamaha doesn't get a front disc this year. By this point, Kawasaki and Honda had both moved on to front discs, which definitely offered more total stopping power, but most of the magazines seem to think the Yamaha's dual shoe drum is still very good. I've ridden some of these bikes with the dual shoes, and that to me strikes a little bit of hyperbole. They did stop, but there's a big difference between the power of the disc in this era and the drum. Obviously, it got the job done, but I think it was a pretty significant handicap if you're trying to go into that first turn with somebody with a disc, particularly if there was mud. The discs were much better at handling inclement conditions where you got a lot of gunk. I know if you got some of these early drums, if they got wet, sometimes the brakes would go away completely, and you just don't have that problem with the disc. The motor is really strong this year. In 83, the YZ was the fastest bike in the class, but it was a little bit peaky, a little difficult to ride. So for 84, Yamaha was going for more a low to mid power band, and they definitely received that in spades. The motor has a very chunky delivery, not a lot of top end, but really good low to mid power. It was very quick, and this is the first year that Yamaha is going to be racing production machines in Nationals and Supercross. At the time, you could run full works bikes, and most of the manufacturers were still doing that. Honda had their ultra exotic RCs, and the Suzuki and everybody else were still running full works machines. But Yamaha decided to run production bikes this year, and it's pretty amazing. Ricky Johnson was able to win the 250 national title on this bike, basically with a set of updated forks and a few porting mods. It really wasn't a whole lot different than the production YZ, and probably more a testament to Ricky's skill on the motorcycle than how excellent this YZ was, but still, it's pretty impressive. The frame is modified for 1984. In 83, they did have some issues with broken frames on hard-ridden YZs, and for this year, they updated the thickness by 5 millimeters on some of the cross tubing and around the shock linkage mount to make sure it was less likely to crack and give it a little bit more resistance to flex under loads. There was also issues in 83 with the impeller leaking coolant into the transmission, and they updated that as well to prevent the case from leaking coolant into the transmission area, which again was not great for reliability. The motor, as I said, is pretty competitive. The chassis is actually, most of the magazines seem to think it's a very excellent handling bike. I had the 85 model, which I was not happy with how it handled. I've never ridden this 84, but it seems like most of the magazines say the bike, handles well. It turns well and what have you. I think it was a pretty competitive machine. I think most people picked the Honda as being the best bike here in 1984, mainly because the Honda had the fastest motor, I think. It had excellent turning, mediocre suspension. None of these bikes had phenomenal suspension. Pretty much the RM was the only one that they would probably rave about the shock on. But it was passable. Certainly, as you can see, it's capable of winning at the highest level. But it seems like the Honda was the pick of most of the magazines, at least in 1984. But overall, this is a pretty significant update and a better machine here for 1984 in the Yamaha camp. For 1985, we get the revamped YZ250N. This machine looks very different, at least here in the US, because this is the first year that Yamaha went to the international white and red color scheme here in the United States. Other markets, of course, had the white and red since probably the original YZs in the mid-70s, but here in the US we had the yellow and black. I really don't know why they made this change. I'm not sure why they went with the yellow and black in the first place and then why they moved to the white and red here in 85. But I remember really liking the change at the time. Now I'm kind of torn on it. The yellow certainly is pretty iconic, but this is a good looking machine. I actually had this machine, as I said, this 85, and it was a really awesome motorcycle in some ways and a really terrible motorcycle in others, in my opinion. For 85, you do get a pretty substantial list of updates, although it's probably the least changed overall YZ in several years, maybe since 80 and 81. The overall bike is very similar to the year before other than the color scheme, but they did make several improvements. The main thing you get, probably the most significant, is probably the front disc brake here, so they upped the stopping ability of the machine. That was certainly a welcome update here for 1985. You also get a stronger swing arm. We have new rims that were supposed to be stronger with stronger steel spokes and nipples. As I mentioned earlier, the Z spokes were a problem in the 84 models. Then while the Z spoke does remain here for 1985, they did update the diameter of the spokes slightly. They were 0.5 millimeters larger in diameter here for 1985. They also went to a composite material instead of steel for the reed valves and added an additional bearing surface to the clutch arm. They did make some porting changes to the motor here for 1985 in order to give the machine a little bit better top-end power. In 84, it was a low to mid missile, and they're trying to get a little wider power band here for 1985. And I can tell from personal experience, they nailed it on the motor front this year. This is the fastest machine in the 250 class by a wide margin this year. It really was one of the awesomest 250 two-stroke motors I've ever owned. And I've had like over 50 motorcycles in my life, and this thing was just an absolute tractor. You could ride it around all day, like just on the low end, and it would just rocket out of turns. But if you got it into the mid-range, it just lit a rocket booster. It was a really fast motor, super chunky delivery, really wide power band. I love the engine on this thing. What I didn't like was the suspension. The forks this year and the shock were super soft settings, and they kind of wallowed. If you left the spring stock, you were going to bottom it out. At the time, I was a novice motocrosser. I was still bottoming the damn thing out all the time. It was really annoying. This year you did get some updates to the rear shock by adding the Yamaha BAS system, which is called the brake actuated suspension system. And what the BAS was a little mechanism, rod that was connected to the rear brake pedal that went to the shock that was supposed to reduce compression damping under braking. When you depress the brake, it opened a valve in the shock, reduced the compression damping, and the idea behind that was to prevent the machine from kicking on braking bumps. I think a lot of people didn't think it worked very well. It seemed like a gimmick. A lot of the magazines suggested just disconnecting it. I know a time or two I hit the rear brake by accident when I landed off a jump, and the shock blew all the way to the friggin' stops. So personally, I didn't think it was that great of an innovation. It only lasted a couple of years here on the YZ lineup, but Yamaha was very proud of it here on the all-new 85 model. Other than that, the machine is very similar to 84. Basically, the motor has a longer power band. It pulls harder on top. Still, low to mid is mostly where the power band was situated, but it definitely had a longer pull on top. I thought the bike handled not very well personally. I found the steering to be very vague and difficult to get it to hug the inside line. Like I said, a lot of the magazines seem to think that the 84 model handled really well, but Dirt Bike, when they tested it here in 85, said it handled like a school bus with 4 flat tires. So that gives you an idea of what the thought of the time was on this machine. It was a rocket fast bike, hindered by a chassis that was in need of a major overhaul, I think. Again, good looking motorcycle. I'd love to have one now to have as a play machine, but as a racer at the time, I just don't think it was the best machine you could get in 1985. For 1986, we have the all-new YZ250S. This is a dramatic redesign of the Yamaha YZ250 platform, a big change after the mild refresh of 1985. This year, the bodywork is all new with a much slimmer ergonomics, a cool little drop tank here, kind of work style tank on it, all new graphics, a revamp to the chassis. This year, they completely redesigned the monoshock in the rear. It went with a more Honda style lower linkage in the back. The new Motocross used a shock that was partnered with Öhlins. Öhlins, I think, was partly owned by Yamaha, I believe, in 1986. I'm not sure if they still have a direct connection, but back then they were partners, and Öhlins apparently designed the shock here that Yamaha used on the YZ lineup in 1986. This new shock moves away from the remote reservoir design to a quote-unquote piggyback design that made the reservoir an integrated unit. This was done to reduce the chances of a hose blowing off and causing a failure. Also, it apparently offered better cooling and more precise action within the shock itself. The BAS system is back for 1986. Unfortunately, Yamaha was still singing its praises at the time. This new shock offered 12.6 inches of travel and 28 settings for compression damping and 25 selectable adjustments for rebound control. Finishing off the new rear suspension was a complete redesign of the swing arm that featured additional bracing and a hollow pass-through to allow you to access the all-new linkage within the swing arm itself. Up front, the 86 YZ250 used a set of 43mm Kayaba conventional forks that provided 12 inches of travel. These forks were similar to what the YZ had employed in 85, aside from a new alumite coating that was designed to reduce stiction and prevent premature oil contamination within the fork itself. The fork's damping was handled by damper rod, with air pressure and 8 selectable settings for compression damping being the only external adjustments. This is significant in that 86 is the first year that Honda offered the cartridge internals on its CR250, which were much more sophisticated and capable of handling a wider range of track conditions. This damper rod fork had been in use for many years, but the arrival of the cartridge internals on the CR250 would quickly show that this old technology was not going to be up to snuff against the new competition. There were some minor changes to its action here for 86, with new damping that upped the compression damping by 10% and increased rebound control by 15%. This was also combined with stiffer springs that were designed to address the utter lack of control shown by the forks the year before. On the chassis front, Yamaha's goals for 86 were to improve precision through increased strength and better weight distribution. In order to reduce frame flex, the new steering head was increased in length by 10mm, the head stay was enlarged, and the swing arm pivot was boxed in for the first time. This increased chassis rigidity significantly and helped reduce the loose feeling that many riders, including myself, complained about in 1985. Chassis geometry was all new as well, with Yamaha focusing on providing better traction to the front wheel. All new bodywork was added that was far slimmer through the middle and flatter across the pilot's compartment. The new tank carried slightly less fuel, but it was far less obtrusive than in the previous years. The shape was one of the narrowest in the class, and the new tank lowered the bike's mass significantly through the use of a work-style drop section on the left. Accompanying the new tank was a redesigned set of radiators that offered more capacity for increased cooling and a lower placement for improved handling. For braking, the 86 YZ250 employed an all-new disc in the front, and a traditional drum continued to be used in the rear. The new disc featured a revised disc material, smaller diameter, and new pad material. All of this was done to improve feel without sacrificing overall power and performance for 1986. On the motor front, Yamaha focused on refining rather than redesigning their motor in 1986. Yamaha spec'd an all-new cylinder with revised porting, enlarged coolant passages, thicker castings, and a move to O-rings for the head gasket material. The Yamaha power valve system drum was decreased in size, and the exhaust port was reshaped to reduce the chance of any heat-related deformation of the cylinder under hard use. The piston was also beefed up for 86 in a further effort to improve durability. In the bottom end, the transmission was revised slightly for 86, with 3rd, 4th, and 5th gears offering a wider spacing than the year before. In order to improve shifting feel, the YZ250 adopted the 490's longer shift lever for 86 as well. This provided greater leverage, but did not entirely address the Yamaha's notoriously notchy shifting. An all-new airbox for 86 offered slightly more volume, but the YZ250 did not receive the YZ125's Trick McCuney flat slide TM mixer. Instead, the 250 made do with the old 38mm round slide McCuney. Finishing off the motor package was an all-new exhaust system that was said to boost top-end power by mimicking the dimensions of Ricky Johnson's 85 Works exhaust. On the track, the redesigned YZ turned out to be a significant improvement in some areas and quite a bit less successful in others. The new ergonomics were loved by all, and the YZ offered the slimmest riding compartment of all the 250s in 1986. The new seat and tank made it easier to get forward in turns, the seating position was flatter, and the bike felt lighter than its 229 pounds would indicate. The new bike was far more accurate in the turns, while also offering admirable stability at speed. It was not as Ginsu-like in the turns as the Honda, but neither were any of the CR's competitors in 1986. Even the annoying Yamaha hop of previous YZs seemed to be mostly exercised by the new, more robust chassis and redesigned rear suspension. Overall, it was a solid handling package and a major improvement over previous Yamaha efforts. On the suspension front, the 86 YZ was a bit of a mixed bag. The new forks worked well enough when compared by 85 standards, but when you compared it against the new 86 Honda CR's cartridge forks, they were woefully lacking. Larger jumps and big whoops were no issue, but the forks deflected rather than absorbing the braking bumps and small holes that littered most hard-packed tracks. While the new hard-coated forks were a huge improvement over the marshmallow-like 85 units, their slightly harsh action paled in comparison to the magic carpet ride delivered by the CR in 1986. Out back, it was a similar story, as the Olins-designed shock and new Motocross delivered a firm ride that laughed at big hits but was flummoxed somewhat by smaller impacts. Acceleration bumps out of turns were transmitted directly to the rider's backside, and riders were generally split on whether the Bass improved its feeling under braking. Some riders claimed the Bass made a noticeable difference when coming down from speed, while others could not feel any real improvement in the shock's compliance over braking bumps. In both cases, the shock's action was only rated as acceptable in these conditions. Compared to 85, the new rear end was a huge improvement, and most riders felt they could live with a slight bit of harshness as a trade-off for the new rear end's much better control at speed. There was none of the old machine's bottoming, wallowing, and sudden kicking, and the YZ could be trusted not to do anything unexpected in the rough. Of all the changes made in '86, by far the most controversial turned out to be the new motor's power profile. After ruling the power division in 1985, Yamaha came back with a less liked motor in 1986. Unlike the tractor-like 85mm, the new 86 version came on soft down low before catching fire in the mid-range. Top-end power was much improved, and the YZ pulled the farthest of any machine in the 250 field. Once on the pipe, it was blistering fast, but the new power band was far harder to use than in the past. Making most of its high RPM rush required skill and commitment, and this new go-for-broke approach only exacerbated the YZ's notoriously stubborn transmission. Shifting under power required the use of a clutch, and it was all but impossible to catch the next gear without backing off the throttle slightly. Even worse, if you did miss a shift, you no longer had the old motor's mountain of torque to fall back on. Flubbing a shift meant losing a great deal of time as you flogged the clutch in an attempt to get the YZ back on the meat of its power. Pro riders had an easier time dealing with the Yamaha's new power characteristics, but even most of them thought the old motor was better overall. Overall, the '86 YZ250S turned out to be a significant improvement in some areas and a bit of a setback in others. The handling, ergonomics, and suspension of the machine were all greatly improved, but the motor was no longer the king of the class. It was still plenty fast, but making the most of that speed demanded talent. The stiff suspension and high RPM power made the YZ more pro-focused and put off many with lesser talent and speed. With some suspension tuning and a little motor massaging, the '86 YZ250 made a very competitive mount, but in stock condition, it had to play second fiddle to Honda's silky smooth CR250 in 1986. After the complete redesign of 1986, you have a much less updated YZ250T here for 1987. The machine looks almost identical, except for the move to white for the radiator shrouds and the addition of fork boots here in '87. Personally, I always loved the look of fork boots. Maybe it's the era I grew up in. I always thought the forks looked naked without them, and I definitely give a thumbs up to the new look of the '87. I like the white shrouds too better. Overall, I think it's a better looking motorcycle. All the bodywork is the same aside from that little swap in color. They made no changes this year as far as that goes. In terms of the motor, they made revisions to the porting with a larger volume pipe, more compression, and a new combustion chamber shape in the head. All were aimed at boosting low-end and mid-range power, which on the '86 model was a little bit lacking. Like I said, they went from a low-end to mid-torquer to a rever, and for '87 they're trying to get some of that grunt back into the power band. They also made some changes to the flywheel. It's a larger diameter here for 1987 to give it a smoother delivery, and the second and third gear ratios are more closely spaced as well to help keep the motor in the sweet spot of its power band. They also made a slight change to the final drive ratio for '87, with 1351 replacing the 1450 used in 1986. On the braking front, the YZ was falling a little bit behind the times here in 1987. Front disc is completely unchanged, although it was a pretty decent performer here in '86, but out back it continues to use a drum brake, which by 1987 was falling behind the competition, as I said. Honda had a disc in back, Kawasaki had a disc I think in '86 in the back, and even Suzuki was moving to a disc brake here by 1987. While the YZ did not get a new disc brake in the back for '87, it did have a slightly larger brake shoe to try and keep up with the competition. Most of the chassis was unchanged other than color. You do get a white frame this year. It definitely looks a little cooler, but significantly the only real change is some additional gusseting to the chassis. Other than that, the geometry and what have you was exactly the same as it was the year before. You do get an upgrade to the bearings within the swing arm to give a little smoother action, and you also get an update to the silencer. The alloy silencer now uses screws instead of pop rivets to make it easier to repack and keep your YZ from getting too ratty. Up front, you get some new internals here for 1987. The addition of a travel control valve, a variable damping system that still used damper rods inside. Kawasaki was using a similar system because they did not want to pony up the extra money for the cartridges. At this point, I think, again, that's falling behind the competition. As I said, in '86, the Yamaha really had a problem with the fork performance in relation to the Hondas of the time, and in '87, unfortunately, I don't think it gets any better. In the back, the shock still uses the BAS system, but there is some new valving updates for 1987 to hopefully improve its action. On the track, the '87 YZ250 was very similar to the '86 model. About the only thing that was really significantly different was the motor. It did run better. It had more low-end and mid-range power. It's not the rev machine that the '86 was, and I think most of the magazines thought it was a better overall power band. The rest of the chassis really handles exactly the same as it did the year before. It was a good turning machine, not a whole lot of head shake. Really, the handicap with the bike is the suspension. The suspension is grim. This year in 87 is not very good. The forks are gruesome, they're harsh, and the rear suspension was pretty poor as well. It's just not up to snuff with what the chassis was capable of. I think if you were able to get the shock redone and put some decent forks on the front of it, it was an excellent motorcycle. Yamaha clearly didn't want to spend the extra money here in 87 to put the cartridge forks on the YZ, and I think it really hurt it in the final standings. If it had had better suspension, it might have been the best bike available in 87, but as it wasn't up to unseating Honda's awesome CR250 in 87. For 1988, we get the all-new YZ250U. This is another major redesign of the YZ platform. This year, we get an all-new chassis, revamped bodywork, and some serious motor upgrades as well. Visually, you can see this has the YZM look, which is derived basically from the looks of the Works YZM 500 Yamaha was racing in the GPs at the time. It's a significant upgrade, I think, in terms of the appearance of the bike. I know in 88, this was considered a really good-looking motorcycle. This is another motorcycle I actually owned back in the day, and I think it was a pretty significant improvement in terms of the ergonomics and certainly the looks department. It's a great-looking motorcycle, I think. This year you get a lot of significant upgrades to the motorcycle. You have a rear disc brake, so Yamaha finally getting up to snuff, although most of the magazines thought the Yamaha's brakes were the least powerful of the big four. At least it does have a disc in the front and the back here in 1988. You also have finally a cartridge fork up front. The Kiaba cartridge fork is a huge improvement and probably the single biggest improvement here for 1988 in terms of the YZ's performance. As I said, in 87, that was kind of the biggest weak link in the Yamaha platform, and for 88, you finally get suspension that's up to snuff with the competition. The new chassis is beefed up. It's supposed to handle better. I personally thought it was a very good handling motorcycle. Yamahas in this era, they're kind of middle of the road handlers. They're not super precise in the turns like the Hondas were, but they didn't head shake either. They were kind of a great do-it-all chassis, and the 88 I thought was a good overall handler in terms of that. The layout is much better. The new tank with the drop on the one side is very slim, gives you a nice riding position. It wasn't quite as thin as like the Hondas were. Here in 88, they went to an all-new low-boy design, and that CR was like razor thin, so it wasn't quite that thin, but it was much better than the previous machines and a very comfortable machine. The seat goes all the way up the tank. It's got a really nice riding position. I thought overall it was a very comfortable machine here in 1988. The motor is a little bit smoother here in 1988. They made a lot of changes internally to it. It runs a little smoother, not quite as barky as the 87. It wasn't a rocket, though. I don't think this motor was nearly as fast as that 85. That was still probably one of the best Yamaha motors I ever rode. And this 88 is certainly very competitive. It's a low to mid-range engine, not a ton of top-end power, but very competitive overall. And this bike was very well regarded. If you look at the tests, Motocross Action actually picked it as the best 250 here in 1988. Some of the other magazines thought the RM was the best machine. It was kind of evenly split as far as that goes, but it was more competitive than it had been in quite a while. Honda dominated the standings in 86 and 87, and then although they came out with that lowboy chassis that was super trick and gorgeous looking, they really made some weird choices in terms of suspension, setup, and motor performance in 88. They kind of set the CR back. It was no longer the king of the class. The cartridge forks, they were set up poorly here in 88, and the motor was really smooth, but actually kind of slow. And most people thought the Yamaha actually had a better engine, interestingly enough. Overall, this was a really significant improvement here and a really competitive year for Yamaha in the 250 class. For 1989, we get the Yamaha YZ250W. In 89, the YZ250 was back with a surprising number of updates for such a successful machine from the previous year. Despite excellent sales figures and a victory in the Motocross Action 250 shootout, Yamaha chose to scrap 90% of the 88 YZ's design in favor of an all-new platform. About the only thing that was not changed was the Works replica bodywork, which returned with minor updates to the graphics. This meant that the two machines appeared very similar at first glance, but underneath the old bodywork beat the heart of an all-new machine. Visually, the biggest change for 89 was the switch from the 88 model's 43mm conventional forks to a set of all-new 41mm inverted Kiaba units. In use by the factory teams for several seasons, the inverted design offered several advantages over its conventional counterparts. Moving the larger portion of the forks to the clamping area increased rigidity of the front end considerably and reduced the amount of unsprung weight in the forks. It also reduced the protrusion of the forks below the axle, thus lessening the chance to catch the forks in a rut. With Supercross becoming an ever greater focus of the manufacturers, it was felt that the inverted forks' increased rigidity outweighed any offsetting reduction in compliance the switch would result in. With the move to inverted forks, the old YZ's frame was no longer sufficiently strong enough to handle the increased loads presented by the more rigid front end. As a result, Yamaha's engineers spec'd an all-new chassis design for 1989. The new frame beefed up the steering head substantially with increased bracing and a new box section front down tube. Both the engine cradle and the main frame spars were also increased in diameter for 89. In addition to the increased strength, the new frame altered the YZ's geometry slightly by increasing the trail by 1 mm and reducing the rake by 1 degree. Both radiators were repositioned lower on the frame to help centralize mass, and the foot pegs were moved rearward slightly to improve the ergonomics. Another welcome addition to the YZ's frame was the incorporation of a removable bar in the rear section of the frame. While not as convenient as the fully removable subframes found on the KX and CR, this new addition did make servicing the shock significantly easier for 89. Paired with the new frame was an all-new swing arm and redesigned shock. The shock remained a Kiaba unit, but a new bladder-style design promised improved damping and increased fade resistance. The new swing arm was substantially larger and stronger for 89, with a move to a push-style chain adjuster for improved reliability. In addition to the improved chain adjusters for 89, the YZ also adopted a new chain buffer that offered a softer compound to alleviate the annoying clatter of the previous 3 years. The new chain roller for 89 offered longer life and reduced noise, and a redesigned chain guide added aluminum bracing for improved durability. All new brakes for 89 offered larger slots for improved cooling and increased pad life. Both the front and rear calipers were redesigned to improve performance and offer easier maintenance. In the rear, a work-style caliper guard improved the appearance of the YZ by replacing the oversized and slightly cobby guard found in 1988 with a lighter and much more finished-looking design straight off of Mickey Diamond's factory racer. Aside from the forks, the most significant change made to the YZ's chassis in 89 was the move to a 19-inch rear wheel. This was also a trick pioneered by the factory teams as they searched for ways to extract more traction out of the hard and slippery supercross circuits. As with the forks, the move to a 19-inch rear wheel was a game of trade-offs, as both the 18 and 19-inch wheels offered their own set of advantages and weaknesses. For professional racing, the 19-inch wheel made a lot of sense, as its shorter and stiffer sidewalls offered less flex in turns and better feel under acceleration. The trade-off for this was less flat protection, less tire selection, at least at the time, and a slightly firmer ride in the rough. For motocross, this seemed like a fair trade-off, but off-road riders looking for a do-it-all machine might have been happier switching back to an 18-inch hoop. In the 89, the debate was far from settled, and Honda would have continued to equip its CR models with an 18-inch rear wheel well into the next decade. On the motor front, Yamaha updated the engine with an all-new cylinder for 1989. The new jug featured revised porting and a massaging of the power valve system. The Yamaha power valve timing was altered to open 250 RPMs later, and the compression was increased slightly through the use of plugs in the crank. A new reed valve was installed that reduced the count from 8 pedals to 6 for increased intake velocity, and an all-new pipe and silencer were bolted on that were designed to reduce sound, improve ground clearance, and offer increased top-end power. The new pipe also tucked in better to reduce the chance of burning the rider's leg, and lowered the vibration by adding an additional mounting point to the frame. Further refining the power for 89 was an all-new air box that offered improved breathing and a 3-fold increase in air boot volume. The carburetor was all new as well, with a move from the 38mm round slide of 88 to an all-new flat slide Mikuni TM38SS mixer. Mikuni claimed this 38mm carb offered improved throttle response and bottom-end torque due to improved fuel atomization offered by the flat slide design. The clutch and transmission remained unchanged for 89, with the YZ offering a close ratio 5-speed to put that power to the ground. On the track, the 89 YZ250 turned out to be an improved version of the bike that riders had enjoyed the year before. The new chassis, revamped suspension, and massaged motor delivered a sharp, snappier, and even more serious machine for 89. The new motor pumped out 2.8 more horsepower than the 88 model and delivered that performance over a broad and effective range. It was slightly less abrupt down low and easier to get hooked up out of turns, but no less strong. The burst of the old motor was smoothed out and funneled into a stronger mid-range hit that continued pulling slightly farther than before. On the chassis front, the YZ250 was once again a solid improvement over 88. The new frame and forks delivered a tremendous increase in chassis strength that could be felt on the track. There was far less flex in the rough, and the front end felt far more sensitive to rider input. The new 41mm forks were not as stiff as the massive 45mm units found on the Honda, and the Yamaha did a much better job of increasing feedback without sacrificing comfort. The new geometry and flex-free chassis improved the steering feel, but the YZ remained less aggressive in the corners than its rivals. The Yamaha turned well, but its front-end traction was never quite as good as the flypaper-like Honda and Suzuki. Thankfully, it also lacked the come-to-Jesus level of headshake inherent to the red and yellow machines. On the ground and in the air, the YZ felt lighter than its 226 pounds, and the machine could be thrown around nearly as easily as the feathery-feeling RM250. The arrival of the 19-inch rear wheel was mostly unnoticed by testers, who were evenly split on its merits. Most non-pros were unable to feel much of an improvement in the rear-wheel traction, but several magazines noted an uptick in flats due to the reduction in sidewall. In the end, the 1989 YZ250 turned out to be a blueprint for a decade of very effective Yamaha 250 machines. Solid handling, well-sorted suspension, and a flexible motor were the keys to Yamaha's 250 success for the coming decade. Never the fastest, flashiest, or most exciting machines in the class, the YZs of this era were everyman machines, bikes capable of winning in the stadiums and slicing through the trees with equal aplomb. In stock condition, it was a great bike, and with a few mods and careful setup, the YZ could be anything you wanted it to be. It was a great overall machine and a solid contender for the best 250 of 1989. For 1990, we're back to the start of the alphabet with the YZ250A. This machine looks very similar at first glance to the 89 and 88 models, but actually there are a lot of updates and improvements here for 1990. Visually, the most noticeable difference is the new forks, which are anodized red. Personally, I thought this was silly. Although I did like fork boots, I'm not sure why I always thought the anodizing forks was kind of a gauche thing. But in any case, they made that change here in 1990. They also painted the handlebars red. So as long as you kept your stock bars on there, you had a lot of red on your YZ. You'll notice the tank is actually slightly different here for 1990. Instead of being asymmetrical with one large shroud on one side and one small shroud on the other, for 1990 tank with the same size shrouds on both sides and a new tank that carries a little bit more fuel and a little lower on the chassis. The seat has an updated graphic with a little bit of the Yamaha strobe on the side, kind of the first time I can remember seeing that strobe graphic on their YZ. Motor-wise, you get a pretty significant update here in 1990. They actually shortened the connecting rod. Normally you hear about Yamahas going with long rods. They actually shortened the rod here 5 millimeters for 1990. They also reduced the height of the cylinder by 5 millimeters and redesigned the head. The combustion chamber and porting was all new this year as well. Your reed valves have moved 4 millimeters closer to the cylinder to reduce intake track length and improve throttle response. The reed valve stoppers are also modified this year to allow a slightly larger opening. A boost port was added to the cylinder between the intake and left rear transfer port, and the exhaust port width was increased by 2 millimeters. The upper edge of the port was also 2 millimeters lower here for 1990. The exhaust was all new and mounted lower. It's not quite a full lowboy exhaust, but you'll notice it does have a lower, it's kind of going lowboy-esque here in 1990 to go along with the new tank design. For 1990, you also get a trick new oval silencer that was slightly larger to reduce sound. The radiators are lower on the chassis by 40 millimeters and move 40 millimeters rearward to centralize mass and offer better turning. The airbox was redesigned slightly to offer a little more water protection by increasing the lip slightly forward to prevent water from splashing inside. The clutch cover becomes a two-piece cover for the first time, and this aids servicing the clutch greatly here for 1990. The seat, in addition to offering some new graphics, is actually mounted 5 millimeters lower here for 1990 and offers a slightly new shape. The Motocross linkage offers a more progressive curve, and the swing arm is now 15 millimeters longer and has a stronger pivot area for increased strength and reduced flex. The fork, in addition to being red anodized here, has a slight increase to the diameter of the tubing for greater rigidity and smoother action. The outside taper of the stanchion was also increased to reduce weight and offset the additional thickness of the tubing. 20-way adjustable rebound damping was added to the fork to go along with the available compression adjustability. The brakes were also upgraded here in 1990 with a new work-style caliper that was smaller and much more rigid to provide better feel and increased stopping power. On the track, the YZ was a solid performer here in 1990. As I said the year before, they had kind of nailed the formula that would kind of see them through the early 90s. None of these YZs in this era are super flashy bikes. They don't have the fastest motors. They don't have the best handling. They're really kind of do-it-all bikes that were really good at a lot of things. They are decent in the turns, good stability, solid power bands. They weren't the fastest bikes. This engine has a really good low to mid power band. Not particularly explosive like the new Kawasaki was here in 1990, but a great do-it-all bike. If you're looking for a machine that kind of covers all the bases, the YZ250 really was a good machine here in 1990. Again, it wasn't probably as exciting as the Kawasaki, which got most of the fanfare this year with the all-new design with the perimeter frame and its spacey-looking graphics. I had the 1990 Honda this year, and it had incredible motor that was just electric, awesome handling, but had awful suspension. So it wasn't nearly as good of a bike, probably this Yamaha in a lot of ways. The CR was really competitive. The Kawasaki is really competitive. But depending on who you were, you probably couldn't go wrong riding this YZ. It was still a very competitive machine and a very good bike here in 1990. For 1991, we get the all-new Yamaha YZ250B1. This is a significant update visually. As you see, you get all new rear bodywork here. Gives it much more of a swoopy look. I love the looks of this machine. I still love it today. I like the magenta color scheme. Clearly we're into the 1990s now with the more radical, crazy colors. The 91, 92 design with this kind of magenta look was always one of my favorites. In addition to the rear bodywork, you get all new suspension here in 1991. You get an upgrade to the front forks. The forks go from a 41mm to a 43mm inverted Kayaba cartridge fork up front, and you have an all new shock in the rear and a redesigned monocross linkage out back. The new linkage and shock adds 0.5 inches of stroke to a total of 12.4 inches of travel here for 1991. The engine is mildly updated. It's not nearly as dramatic as the rest of the machine. You do get some updates to the porting here in 1991, but the motor really kind of runs very similar to it did the year before. Now that's actually a good thing. The 91 motor and the 90 motor are some of the best in the class, and this 91 is rated one of the best machines. In fact, Motocross Action picked it as the best machine in 1991. The new suspension works very well. The bike is an excellent handling machine. Like I said, it's one that's not on the fringes like the Suzuki or the Honda, much more in the middle of the road, but it does what it does very well. The bike's very comfortable. It's good looking. It's reliable. It has very well sorted suspension here. The new forks work very well, and the motor is very well liked. About the only problem it has is, as I had spoken about earlier, all these YZs had fairly notchy shifting. Wasn't as much of a problem on the YZ250 as it was on the 125, where you're having to kind of pin it and slam that gear in at full throttle. On the 250, you could take your time a little more, so it wasn't as annoying, but it kind of is one of those things that does bother some riders more than others. The clutch pull was also a little bit less smooth than it was on like the Honda or Suzuki, but overall it's a very good chassis and a very good motor here in 1991. I think there really isn't much to complain about. Some people thought the rear suspension wasn't as good as the year before, but overall it was a very, very good machine here in 1991 and a very competitive 250 for Yamaha. Here for 1992 we get Yamaha's YZ250 D1. Interestingly, they skipped C1. I don't know why. I'm sure it made sense to someone in Japan, but in 91 it was the B1, now it's the D1. I don't know, maybe the C1 is some super secret, top secret machine that never made it to production. In any case, we have a fairly minor update here for 1992. While the basic YZ package was little changed for 1992, Yamaha did make several refinements in an effort to keep the magenta missile on top. For the motor, Yamaha's engineers spec'd all new porting, refined the power valve action, and improved the sealing with new bearings and seals. They also beefed up the piston, rings, wrist pin, and crankshaft. To aid throttle response and power, Yamaha massaged the intake track and spec'd a revised exhaust. Lastly, the engineers mounted larger radiators to handle the increased heat from the hot rod motor. In the suspension department, Yamaha mounted all new Kayaba forks, which were copies of the ones found on the KX250 at the time. They added wider triple clamps and a new temperature compensating Kayaba shock. Travel was up slightly front and rear, and a 2mm larger axle for 92 helped fight flex. Wrapping up the packages were bold new graphics, which were still magenta, and a new Weisinger style front end and number plate. Personally, I love this look. I thought it was great. In 91, it was kind of funny because you had the really sleek back end, but the front end was old school, and here for 92, you have a front end that kind of matches that. I know not everybody liked the Aero front end at the time, but I always thought it was a really good looking machine, and I love this. It's probably my favorite front end of all the YZs of the 90s. On the track, the new YZ250 produced one of the best motocross power spreads in 1992. It offered a solid, torquey, and hooked-up delivery that made excellent use of every ounce of power from its 249 cc's. It was snappy off idle and pulled well from the first crack of the throttle. In the mid-range, the YZ really came alive with a strong and chunky surge of torque that powered the YZ out of turns and over obstacles with ease. On the top end, the YZ revved, but it steadily petered out as you came closer to the red line. While the 92 YZ made solid power in all three stages of its power curve, the majority of its thrust was to be found in the mid-range. It was the kind of power that was both easy to use and fun to ride. My best friend at the time had this 92 YZ, and I loved the way this motor ran. It was really a good chunky power delivery, excellent overall power band, and a good motorcycle in terms of most everything as far as I'm concerned. On the suspension front, the YZ was rated the second best in 92. At the time, Kawasaki kind of had a stranglehold on the suspension rankings, but this YZ was very good. I thought the bike was, in stock condition, very raceable. At the time, I was racing a 1990 CR250, And my buddy's 92 YZ, the suspension was so much better. It was like night and day better. I do remember that, in 93, my other buddy got a 93 KX250, and that thing was like a magic carpet compared to my Honda. So probably anything would have been better than the 1990 CRs, which are notoriously bad. But I was really jealous. When I got on his YZ, I was like, damn, this thing just soaks up everything. It worked so much better than the Honda in terms of the suspension action for sure. The overall bike, I don't think it turned as well as my CR, but I think it was better stock for stock, just a better motorcycle probably. It did everything well, and once again was one of the most highly regarded machines in 1992. Yamaha was really on a roll at this time in the early 90s, and they were knocking it out of the park with these Yamaha YZ250s, and it was an excellent era for the YZ and a great time to be riding magenta in the 250 class. Here for 1993, we get Yamaha's all-new YZ250 E1. This machine is radically redesigned from top to bottom. Certainly appearance-wise, it's much different than the year before. You get all new bodywork here on the machine. Overall, I didn't really care for the looks of the bike at the time, but I think it looks kind of cool now. Interestingly, bikes here in the United States had this kind of a purple seat in 93, and it seems like in other markets, I'm not sure exactly if all of them had this, but certainly in a lot of the other markets, they seem to have kept the magenta seat in 93. Just an interesting little side tidbit on the different color schemes around the world. 93 brings about a major update to the chassis. Interestingly, Yamaha claims that they kept the geometry the same here for 93. The 92, as I said, was a good handling motorcycle, so that's not particularly surprising, but they did come out with an all-new frame. The frame here is said to be 20% stiffer than the previous year. They updated all the tubing and all the gusseting to make the machine more precise in the turns and more solid down the straights. You get new forks this year as well, which are certainly handsome looking. They have a cool anodizing on them. Unlike the wacky red of 1990, you have the kind of a works look, almost a Cerakote look, which I think looks pretty badass. The top triple clamps are new and also have that works look as well. They claim to have improved damping inside the Kiaba internals. The cartridge rod is 5 millimeters larger for 1993, and there's modified damping inside. In the rear, the Kiaba rear shock is 2 millimeters larger in diameter to increase oil capacity, and has a larger shock body, which was 46 millimeters instead of the 44 millimeters used the year before. This lessened the chance of overheating and fading in a long moto. There also was major updates to the linkage as well here in 1993. The motor is pretty much unchanged aside from a few porting changes and an all-new lowered exhaust. This one has a true low-boy exhaust, similar to what Honda introduced in 1988 on their CR250. It gives the machine certainly a different look exterior-wise on the motor, but the basic motor is very similar to the year before. There is a new exhaust pipe, as I said. There's a more efficient silencer. The machine does get a larger air box, a bigger air boot. They revised the power valve shape here for 93 and new porting specs. They also added a coating to the shift forks to make them shift smoother and added a new 8-plate clutch to improve shifting action and clutch feel. The radiators were also 15% larger here for 93 to aid cooling. On the braking front, the rotors were updated with stainless steel rotors front and rear with new pads, and Yamaha also increased the size of the front number plate here for 93. It still had the kind of stylized front number plate, but they made it a little wider here in 93 to accept 3-digit numbers. As I said earlier, I really prefer the 92 look, but it is more practical here in 93. It does give you a little more space for numbers if you are a 3-digit rider. In terms of performance, the 93 YZ was very well rated. The new chassis handled very well. It also had pretty good suspension this year. The motor was, again, a good mid-range motor, very, very flexible. Wasn't as fast as the CR250, which was the rocket of the class this year. And the suspension wasn't as good as the KX250, which pretty much had suspension on lockdown in this era. But if you combined all the things that a motorcycle does, it was very good overall. Not really a standout in any one category, but a great overall machine. When Dirt Bike did their shootout here in 93, it was neck and neck with the Kawasaki for the best machine. But depending on what you're planning to do with the machine, I don't think you could go wrong with the YZ250 in 1993. For 1994, we get an interesting list of updates here on the YZ250. First up, you get some updated graphics here that add the iconic lightning bolts to the side panels. I was never a big fan of this year's graphics. I thought they were not particularly attractive at the time, although the works version is pretty cool looking. This bike is very similar to the 93, but they did make an interesting change in this year in that they actually lowered the travel of the suspension front and rear. That's something you just really hadn't seen in the modern motocross era, certainly since the mid-70s when they kept increasing travel. Yamaha thought that they could improve the handling of the YZ by actually making it like a half an inch shorter here in 1994, which is pretty interesting. They thought it would aid turning. So both the fork and shock are actually shorter here in 1994. Motor-wise, there's minor updates. They updated the porting. They made some updates to the power valve. They changed the ratios in the transmission, but it's really the same basic motor configuration they've been using since 1982. The same power valve design and what have you, with some minor tweaks over the years. The overall suspension here is very similar. They did make a couple of little tweaks here. They changed the spring rate slightly in the forks, updated the valving, and as I said, shortened the travel slightly. In the rear, a lot of people had complained about the 93 model having kind of a droop under acceleration. The rear shock tended to drop down under acceleration, and Boyce & Link and some others made different aftermarket links for the YZ to prevent that. A lot of people thought that the Yamaha factory might actually make that change for 94, but they didn't. They ended up keeping the same basic shock linkage here for 94, but they did make some changes to the valving and the shock, and of course shortened it as well. Overall, this 94 model is very similar to the 93. It's a great do-it-all machine. The motor is actually maybe even a little slower here in 94. It seems like the magazines weren't really complaining because the bike was so electric. The 93 was super easy to ride, and this 94 also super easy to ride. Compared to machines like the fire-breathing CR, the Yamaha feels a little bit slow, but it's still competitive because it does such a good job of translating what power it has to the track. On the dyno, it put out some really good numbers, but it didn't feel really fast, the seat of the pants kind of thing. The bike, though, was very competitive again in 94. A good overall machine. It kind of suffered the same problems that it had the year before, where you're getting outshone by Honda in the horsepower category and Kawasaki on the suspension. But if you're looking for a great do-it-all machine, the YZ was once again a great choice in 94. By the mid-90s, most of the manufacturers were updating their machines every 3 to 4 years, and this is the last year for this life cycle of the Yamaha platform that came out in 1993. This 1995 YZ250 is a refined version of that original machine, and Yamaha did make some minor updates here on the chassis and a fairly major one to the motor. This is the first significant update to the YZ250 motor since the 82 introduction of the Yamaha power valve system, in that they added a resonance chamber to the cylinder for the first time. This was a bit of technology that Honda had used early on in the 80s with their ATAC, and Kawasaki later integrated into their Kawasaki integrated power valve system. Kawasaki was the first to combine the variable exhaust port with the resonance chamber to get the advantage of variable porting and essentially the effect of having two exhaust pipes in one. At low RPM, the resonance chamber opens up and essentially gives you more volume to your exhaust, giving you sort of a torque pipe. And then at higher RPMs, that chamber gets closed off, giving you the benefits of a rev pipe. So you're basically getting two exhaust pipes in one and still getting the benefit of that variable exhaust port. So for 1995, Yamaha kind of added that to the motor, and it came out with pretty spectacular results. I actually owned this motorcycle as well. I had a 95 YZ250, and I really loved that bike. It was a great machine. I love the looks this year, the new graphics. These are my favorite of the designs of the 93, 94, and 95. You have kind of the lavender, interesting color for the frame, and the graphics I think really pop. It's in my opinion at least, a very good looking motorcycle. Here in 95, you get some minor updates to the chassis. They updated the fork tube offset and also the steering head slightly to try and get better turning, but it seems like it might have backfired. Most of the magazines seem to think the YZ actually didn't turn any better, but now it actually had bits of head shake every now and again, something that Yamaha had not had in quite a while. So I think most people thought the 94 chassis actually handled better than this 95. It was not terrible in my opinion. I never had any really scary moments on this bike like I had on the Honda, but it was definitely a little more twitchy than like the previous YZs I'd ridden in the past. I've had several of them, and this was maybe a little more aggressive in terms of that way. But like I said, it wasn't the tank slapper kind of crazy nonsense you deal with on a Honda or Suzuki this era. The forks this year were updated, and they work pretty well. The shock, in particular, though, is a standout. Most of the magazines actually thought the shock was one of the best, and Motocross Action actually ranked it as the best rear shock in 1995. The new motor was very smooth. Again, it's not as hard-hitting as the Honda. Interestingly, if you look at the dyno charts, the CR and the YZ are almost identical. They put out the same peak horsepower, and the curve actually looked the same on paper, but they didn't feel the same on the track. The Honda had a chunkier feel to it. The YZ was more snappy down low, more linear. There was not a lot of hit to the motor. It never really exploded. It just hooked up and went. And as long as you were fine with the motor not being really explosive, it was a great engine. I loved it. About the only beef I had with it was I had to put race gas in it because it would definitely ping sometimes on pump gas. In the shootout standings this year, Motocross Action picked it as the bike of the year. It was a really great motorcycle. I think, again, some people preferred the Honda because it was sharper turning and the motor was probably much more exciting. But in terms of actual effectiveness on the track, this was an excellent motorcycle in 1995. Big changes here for 1996 on the YZ250. This is the first year of this redesign, and you get an all-new chassis, revamped motor, and completely new bodywork. This is another big change where they went to the blue for the first time for the corporate look, a look that Yamaha's more or less stayed with continuously since. This first version obviously has the white fenders, so it's not completely blue, and it's this very unique deep blue that they only used, I think, in 96 and 97, if I remember correctly. It's darker than the current Yamaha blue you'd see on a modern machine. Overall, I thought it was a good-looking bike in the time. Certainly more racy looking and sleeker than the 95. The 95 I thought was good-looking as far as the graphics go, but this bodywork is certainly handsomer. Would be the kind of iconic look of Yamaha's going forward here for the next 10 years or so. This bike is, as I said, updated front and rear, all new suspension. The motor itself is the same basic design as 1995, but it ended up running completely different on the track. In 95, the YZ250 had an excellent power band that was very fast, got a lot of hole shots, very powerful engine, just very smooth and easy to ride, kind of that excellent combination of power and rideability. And for 96, all the horsepower went missing for some reason. I'm not sure what Yamaha did, but they definitely screwed something up, and this motor was slow. I remember my best friend bought one brand new, and it was shocking to me how slow this thing was. It was way slower than my 95. And the chassis was certainly more modern, although I thought the ergonomics felt a little cramped. The riding position is a little bit more compact than the 95 was. But obviously, that can vary as far as personal taste goes. The suspension this year was super soft and not nearly as good as the year before. All the magazines complained of bottoming. If you're very heavy or fast, you're going to go through that suspension travel pretty quick. Pretty much overall, the bike was an improvement in technology, but it was still an unfinished product. The motor was slow. The bike went from the best machine in 1995 to the last place machine in 96, despite being all new and quote-unquote improved. This 96 model certainly was the genesis for a line of really great YZs going forward, but it would take Yamaha a couple of years to kind of sort out this new platform and get it going in the right direction again. Next up on our rundown is the 1997 YZ250. After the disappointing reactions the 96 YZ250 elicited among the press, Yamaha knew they needed to bring some pizzazz back to their 250 platform if they wanted to steal back a bit of the motocross mindshare in 97. With that as a goal, Yamaha's engineers made horsepower their number one priority here for 1997. The motor was all new in 95, and that YZ motor was well regarded for its power potential, but changes made in 96 had neutered its performance. So for 97, Yamaha looked to roll back the clock and restore the potent power of the previous model YZs. First up on that agenda was an all-new top end for 97 that featured revised porting and a redesigned head shape. Both the exhaust and the exhaust boost ports were lowered, and the intake port was decreased in size to increase intake velocity. The shape of the Yamaha power valve system drum was reshaped, and the governor controlling its action was also retimed to open later. There was an all-new reed block, which moved from 6 pedals to 4, and they repositioned the intake to sit 7mm farther back to provide a more linear low-end response. To improve exhaust scavenging, the exhaust spigot was repositioned 5.5mm forward, and an all-new pipe was bolted on that boosted mid to top end performance. In the bottom end, Yamaha reshaped the transfer ports to be steeper to facilitate better scavenging. The carburetor remained a 38mm Keihin unit, but there was a new float bowl that added a separator to prevent fuel sloshing. A new ignition was bolted on that revised the timing to further boost low to mid performance. There was also an all-new filter for 97 that added a second pin for more secure sealing. Although this didn't really do much for performance, it did hopefully prevent any kind of issues with sucking dirt into the motor. As I had mentioned earlier, Yamaha transmissions in the 80s and 90s were not the smoothest on the track by any means, and for 97, Yamaha made some upgrades here to try and improve its action. The transmission maintained the same ratios the year before, but it featured new straight-cut gears that were designed to offer a smoother engagement and lessen the YZ's notoriously notchy shifting. A revised clutch mechanism moved away from the ball bearing and pushrod arrangement used in 96 to a new needle bearing and thrust washer design. This was done to prevent deformation under hard use and provide a more uniform pressure within the clutch mechanism. On the chassis front, the YZ was upgraded but not dramatically changed for 97. The new frame maintained the same geometry as the year before, but they did add a larger diameter front motor mount, a thicker steering head gusset, and enlarged the main down tube for additional strength. The rear linkage was unchanged, but Yamaha did add a new polylube bearing that was designed to provide smoother operation and longer intervals between servicing of the rear end. The foot pegs were enlarged here for 97, and they offered a wider profile for improved support, and a new bar bin was added with a wider and taller shape to reduce rider fatigue. The bodywork remained largely unchanged in shape, aside from a slightly thicker mounting point on the shrouds, designed to lessen the chance of catching on knee braces. This was an issue in 96, where the shroud would be pulled out by your knee braces where it met the tank. This was a big annoyance for guys who wore knee braces, and for 97 they made some changes to hopefully prevent that from happening as often. The front fender, number plate, and frame moved to a deeper blue here for 97, giving the machine a more uniform look overall. There were new graphics that did away with the kind of crazy over-the-top explosion look in 96 that I actually liked, but it was a little bit, certainly very 90s. And they moved to the more understated blue and white strobe effect, which mimicked the look of the graphics used on the factory machines. Seat foam was upgraded here for 97 with a slightly firmer compound to improve comfort. The brakes continued to use Akebono components, but there were new rotors here for 97, which offered increased resistance to bending and improved feel of the lever through larger and stronger mounting points. Lastly, they added an all-new chain guide for 97, which featured thicker aluminum construction, a more durable pad material, and a new shape designed to allow for the use of larger rear sprockets. Suspension upgrades for 97 included an all-new KYB fork that featured revamped valving, stiffer springs, and a redesign to the non-circulating cartridge system for smoother operation. Travel was set at 11.8 inches, with external adjustments available for compression and rebound control. In the rear, the KYB shock featured all-new valving and a firmer spring for improved bottoming resistance. Rear travel was set at 12.4 inches, with compression and rebound continuing to be externally adjustable on the YZ shock. On the track, the 97 YZ250 turned out to be a significantly upgraded motocross machine. The new motor offered a much improved response down low and a stronger hit through the mid-range. Top end power remained lacking compared to rockets like the CR250, but the Yamaha's new motor was far more competitive than it had been in 1996. It was not as burly as the KX down low and not as quasar fast as the Honda on top, but it was snappy, broad, and easy to ride. The low to mid power band was always ready, and the YZ put every one of its 43 horsepower right to the ground. In 96, the YZ had been down as much as 5 horsepower to the competition, but the new motor was right in the thick of things, with a rating that only lost out to the Honda on the dyno. Fast guys still tended to gravitate to the Honda and Kawasaki, and the transmission remained a bit notchy, but the YZ was no longer the whipping boy of the 250 division. On the handling front, the YZ remained an excellent do-it-all machine. The chassis was not as sharp in the turns as the RM, but it was not as wayward at speed as the Honda either. It was the perfect Goldilocks combination of good turning and excellent stability. The YZ never shook its head at speed and rarely put a wheel out of place. It was nearly as happy diving to the inside line as it was railing the outside berm, and no other machine in 97 was as versatile in its handling as the Yamaha. For Supercross, machines like the RM had an advantage, but if you were looking for a bike that inspired confidence inside and out, the YZ was the pick of the litter in 97. Suspension performance was also much improved here for 97. In 96, of course, the YZ suspension performance had proven to be a serious handicap. It was way too soft and underdamped for almost anybody outside of the novice class. In 97, Yamaha stiffened up both ends and brought some control back to the YZ suspension repertoire. The new forks offered much better bottoming resistance and a firmer ride, and most racers felt it was a significant improvement front and back. Overall, the 97 YZ250 proved to be a solid second act for Yamaha's next-generation YZ platform. It addressed most of the issues that riders had with the 96 machine and delivered a much more competitive racing product. It was not as fast as the CR and not as plush as the Kawasaki, but it offered a great do-it-all package that delivered on the promise from the year before. Here for 1998, you get the third year of the all-new YZ250 platform, and Yamaha was steadily improving this bike. In 96, it certainly had a lot of potential, and in 97 and 98, you could see further refinements made the machine even more competitive. Visually, you'll see the 98 here has the newer blue. They went away from the dark navy blue of the 96 and 97. I know a lot of people like that color, but it was a color that showed a lot of distress, meaning little scuffs and scratches were really apparent. And if you ever did crease a fender, it had a really ugly white crease in the middle of it. And this newer, lighter blue was more durable, certainly showed less wear and tear. This color would be the Basically, the blue I think they even use today, I don't think it's a whole lot different than this 98 color. Visually, the bike is very similar to the year before. Really clean graphics. I like the looks of these bikes quite a bit. You do get a few ergonomic improvements here for 1998. They made some changes to the chassis. The geometry was a slightly steeper here in 98 to try and make the machine turn a little better. And they also added a 10 millimeter taller seat. And they moved the handlebars up and out a little bit to make the machine a little roomier. As I said earlier, the 96 and 97 were kind of cramped bikes if you're very tall. The ergonomics were pretty tight, so for 98 they opened it up a little bit to make the riding compartment more suitable for somebody who's a little taller. This year you get an all-new fork. It's what they call a bumper-style fork, and then it has a rubber bumper, like an elastomer bumper within the forks for bottoming resistance, similar to what you see on the bottom of a shock. You also get all-new valving with a larger cartridge rod here in 1998. The rear shock is updated slightly. The linkage was based on what the factory machines were running in 1997, and they also added a new shock that increased stroke, although the travel of overall of the rear end stayed the same. The shock did have a longer stroke here in 1998. Motor changes included new porting, a revised cylinder head, and some minor updates to the power valve system. They also lowered the primary gear ratio to increase throttle response. They also updated the ignition this year to allow the machine to rev a little freer on top and improve throttle response. This motor was basically the same sort of power band it had the year before. Yamaha was going for more hit here in 98, but it didn't turn out to be a whole lot more potent. But the power band was rated probably the best overall in terms of the width of the power curve and how usable it was. It was an excellent motor, just wasn't as fast on top as the Honda or as grunty down low as the Kawasaki. The KXs in this era were tractors that just ripped out of the hole. They were super fun to ride, and that seems to be what most of the magazines loved about them and why they were winning shootouts at the time. This Yamaha doesn't have that hit or that snap that some of the others had, but it was super flexible, easy to ride. I think most of the magazines picked it as probably the second best 250 here in 1998. It was certainly very competitive. If you were looking for a bike that handled well and did everything well, but maybe just didn't have quite the pizzazz of some of the other machines, it was a great choice here in 1998. And Yamaha is really refining this package to make it better year over year. Here for 1999, we get the most significant update to the all-new YZ platform. This year, Yamaha's engineers finally got the green light to scrap the well-worn old motor design, which had been in use since 1982, for an all-new engine design. The new motor was redesigned from the ground up, with everything from the placement of the crankshaft to the angle of the cylinder rethought to optimize performance. The crankshaft was repositioned to sit 13 millimeters lower in the cases, while also being larger in diameter and lighter overall. The connecting rotor was redesigned with a smaller diameter lower bearing and a thinner construction to save weight. The piston was all new and lighter, with a shorter wrist pin and slightly smaller diameter. The new motor reconfigured the bore and stroke from the old motor's 68 by 68.8 millimeters to the same 66.4 by 72 millimeters employed by Honda's CR250. The top end was all new with a smaller diameter head, an all new power valve system, and a more vertically arranged placement. The old cylinder had cantered forward 10.7 degrees, while the new 99 motor sat in a nearly vertical 2.5 degrees. The new cylinder retired the original Yamaha power valve system design in use since 1982 and introduced an all-new triple valve design which featured a guillotine-style main valve with two additional valves to control the exhaust boost ports. The ball ramp governor that controlled the power valve was redesigned by increasing the size of the balls and reshaping the cup for more precise control of the mechanism. In 1998, one of the most pleasant surprises on the all-new YZ400F had been the silky smooth operation of its transmission. Long a Yamaha problem, notchy gear engagement had been the YZ's tradition for over 2 decades. For 1999, the YZ250 adopted the 400F's transmission design with larger shafts and redesigned shift forks that were pinned to the shift shafts. The transmission remained a 5-speed, the clutch remained largely unchanged, but the actuator was repositioned inside the ignition cover, and a new O-ring seal replaced the old gasket on the clutch cover to ease maintenance. The clutch cable was reduced in diameter by 0.5 millimeters to improve feel and reduce weight. The oil filler hole was enlarged as well to make oil changes easier here in 99. On the intake side, an all-new 38mm Keihin carburetor was installed that added a power jet circuit for increased response at low RPMs. First introduced by Honda on the 97 CR250, the power jet was an additional fuel circuit in the carburetor that was controlled by a solenoid that enriched the fuel mixture at low RPMs. At 8,500 RPM, the solenoid cut off fuel to this additional circuit to prevent the motor from running too rich and reducing performance at high RPM. Exhaust duties were handled by an all-new pipe with thinner stampings to reduce weight and a redesigned profile to improve power. A new silencer was added with a flush resin end cap to reduce the chance of the stinger packing with dirt or causing an injury in a crash. On the chassis front, the YZ499 was new but not radically updated. The new frame featured several changes needed to accommodate the new motor, but the overall geometry was very similar to 1998. The biggest change to the chassis was an all-new swing arm, which was a half-pound lighter than a 98 and featured all-new castings and a repositioning of the lower shock mount. The axle plates were redesigned as well and manufactured to accept a 2mm larger rear axle for 99. The new linkage for 99 retained the same rising rate as the year before, but it featured a mechanical advantage over the old design by repositioning the angle and placement of the shock mounting. Aside from the new swing arm and linkage, the most significant frame change was new foot peg brackets that relocated the foot pegs 3.5mm closer to the frame and reduced weight slightly. Paired with the new linkage was an updated Kayaba shock with 15mm of additional travel, increased gas capacity, and updated valving. The additional gas capacity was designed to reduce fading, and the extended travel and relocated linkage were employed to provide smoother performance under braking. The revised valving was set up to offer freer movement of the shock at slow speeds while providing greater resistance to bottoming on hard hits. Total travel clocked in at 12.4 inches, with external adjustments for compression and rebound damping. Up front, the 99 YZ250 employed a substantial revision to the KYB fork with stronger outer tubes and reduced friction in the piston, seals, and bushing area. The new silverware maintained the bumper-style design of the year before, but added updated valving with additional high-speed compression damping and a revised blow-off valve. To further save weight, the outer tubes were tapered, and the nut on top of the cartridge valve was changed to aluminum. Bodywork remained unchanged from 98, except for the new work-style graphics that mimic the design seen on the 98 factory machines. The bars, seat, and brakes were all carryovers from the year before. New wheels, front and rear, added Takasago Excel rims, a 2mm larger axle in the rear, 1mm larger spoke nibbles, and lighter weight hubs. All told, Yamaha's weight-saving program here in 99 added up to a 2-pound savings overall from the 98 design. On the track, the revamped YZ250 proved to be one of the best 250s available in 99. The new motor was head and shoulders better than the 98 power plant, with an incredibly wide power band and hooked-up delivery. Throttle response was excellent, with a much livelier feel than in the past. The new motor picked up fast and revved more quickly, while never feeling abrupt or difficult to control. The low-end power was not as strong as the Burley KX, and the mid-range hit was less abrupt than the shoulder-tugging CR, but no other bike in the class offered the Yamaha's combination of outright power and ease of use. It retained the smooth delivery of the 98 motor while pumping up the power significantly everywhere on the power band. Low to mid power was substantially improved, with a stronger surge off idle and a healthy mid-range hit. Top end was good, but the YZ was happier if you grabbed the next gear rather than keeping it pinned until the cows came home. Grabbing the next gear was also much easier than in the past with the YZ400F style transmission. For the first time in the Yamaha's history, the YZ250 offered the smoothest and most positive shifting in the class. On the chassis front, the YZ continued to be an excellent handler, but not everyone was in love with the settings Yamaha chose for the front forks here in 99. Fast guys thought they were too softly sprung and damped, and even moderately fast guys thought the bike would have benefited from stiffer coils. In the rear, the shock was much more universally praised for its plush feel and excellent tracking in the rough. It was noticeably firmer than the front forks, while still offering excellent comfort and control. Big jumps and whoops were no issue, and the YZ could handle novice and pros without too many complaints. In stock condition, the soft front forks and stiff shock hindered the YZ's chassis balance, but once the front springs were upgraded and the clickers dialed in, the YZ suspension was a willing motocross companion in 99. Overall, the 99 YZ250 proved to be a solid improvement in performance and one of the best machines available in 99. Its new motor was broad, flexible, and fast, while its chassis provided handling to put it at the front. Its suspension required a bit of fine-tuning, but once you dialed it in, the bike was capable of winning on any track and at any level. Here for 2000, we get a year of fairly minor updates on the YZ250. After having an all-new motor added for 99, Yamaha did not change anything internally on the YZ250 motor here in 2000. It's exactly the same engine it was the year before, aside from the carburetor. In 1999, they used a 38mm Keihin PWM carburetor with the PowerJet. And here for 2000, they moved to the 38mm PWK PowerJet carburetor. The ignition was remapped as well to work with the new PowerJet system on the revised carburetor. Chassis changes were very minor as well. The main update was a new triple clamp, which was beefier on the lower clamp and more roomy up top. It moved the bars another 10mm forward, again to give a little more room for taller riders here in 2000. Graphically, the bike is very similar. The main thing you'll notice is a new fender. This is the first fender design change since 1992, and I think most people think it's a improvement. It still has the basic arrow design the previous one used, but it's a little sleeker here in 2000. And you also get a redesigned front number plate as well, which moved the mounting of the bolt so it's no longer as obvious with a hole in the front of the number plate. The other visual cue you'll notice here for 2000 is the new white airbox. Now this strikes to me a bit of hyperbole. Yamaha claimed that this new airbox lowered intake temperatures by a few degrees. Honda had a white airbox in the early 2000s. I always hated those things because they track all the gunk from your boots onto the airbox and gets a black smudge on the darn thing after you ride it a little bit. I think personally this was done as a gimmick to kind of give the bike a new look. In any case, they claimed it was a little better. It didn't last very long though. It was gone after a couple years, so you can draw your own conclusion as to exactly how effective this change in the color of the airbox plastic was. In addition to the updated airbox, you also get a minor change to the frame here. They moved from steel to aluminum for the subframe here in 2000 to lower weight. They also updated the forks slightly with a new aluminum piston rod to save weight and offer smoother action. They made a change in the shock to a new aluminum holder shaft bearing to separate the high and low speed compression damper adjuster. Internally in the motor, the only significant change was an updated clutch, which redesigned the pressure plate for improved action. They also changed the shape of the clutch pushrod and the angle of the clutch actuator arm to move more fluidly. On the track, the new YZ250 was a awesome machine. It wasn't a whole lot different than the year before, but the sum total of 4 years of development ended up with the bike that Motocross Action and Dirt Bike picked as the best 250 in 2000. The motor, again, was not an incredible powerhouse, but when you combined rideability and overall power, it was rated the best motor in the class by many testers. The suspension worked very well here in 2000. The chassis handled well. It was a really, really well sorted package and an awesome motorcycle here in 2000. Motocross Action and Dirt Bike both picked it as the best machine. MX Racer and Dirt Rider preferred the Honda. This year in 2000, the Honda gets a redesign, which is much improved as well. The Honda maybe offered a little more pizzazz. The motor was definitely really potent here in 2000, but I think most testers thought the Yamaha was either first or second overall. It's an excellent motorcycle here in 2000 with very, very few complaints from any of the testers that seem to have ridden it. Here for 2001, the YZ250 gets a fairly significant list of updates. It's certainly not a major redesign by any means, but they did make a few more changes than they had the year before. Internally, there were a number of small changes here in 2001. They updated the crankshaft and the connecting rod slightly. They also changed the volume of the head. The compression ratio was increased from 8.8 to 1 to 9.1 to 1 here in 2001. They also updated the porting and added a lighter piston here in 2001. The water pump was updated to allow more water flow, and the clutch cover was moved from aluminum to magnesium to save 100 grams of weight. The shift cam was reduced in weight inside the transmission, and the rear taper cone in the exhaust pipe was made steeper for more over-rev. There was a new pipe here for 2001 with a redesigned shape to give the machine a little more over-rev, and the silencer end cap was actually reduced by 1 millimeter in diameter to increase back pressure in the exhaust. The 2001 frame here uses a thinner material and a slightly higher grade of chromoly steel on the down tube. This was done to lower weight and increase strength. The swing arm was also made of a higher grade of aluminum this year, which allowed the use of a 0.5 millimeter thinner material to save weight. The Kiaba bumper fork has a nylon spacer added to eliminate spring clanking, and a stiffer rubber bumper to improve bottoming feel. Additionally, the compression and rebound damping have firmer settings here in 2001. The rear shock's ball bearing was replaced with a needle bearing, and the rubber bumper is also thicker and taller, and the spring retainer guide is moved to aluminum instead of steel to save weight. The front rotor is a floating type this year, and the diameter is increased by 5 millimeters to 250 millimeters. The front master cylinder and brake lever are now made by Nissan and similar to the Kawasaki design. The seat for 2001 is a two-tone cover with black on the top and blue on the sides. On the track, this is an excellent motorcycle. It continues to be either number 1 or number 2 in most shootout standings. Just like 2000, it seems like some of the magazines are evenly divided on whether they think the Honda or the Yamaha is the best bike, but it is right at the top in both cases. I think the only complaint, once again, is the motor. It doesn't offer the most burst in the class, but again, it's said to have the best power band brand overall. Like any shootout, it comes down to personal choice, but there's no complaints from anybody on the performance of the YZ overall. About the only complaint you hear from anybody is the graphics don't last very long. They tend to get shredded, particularly if you are wearing knee braces, but that's pretty common amongst all the motorcycle manufacturers. And anytime you have the graphics going up on the tank, they're going to be a little less durable than they would be on a machine that has all the graphics on the shroud. Overall, it's an excellent motorcycle here in 2001, and certainly one of the best machines available this year. Here for 2002, the YZ250 gets its most significant chassis update since the redesign in 1996. This year you get an all-new frame, completely redesigned bodywork, and some minor updates to the motor. The most significant change obviously is the new bodywork. It has a all-new look this year. I love this design. In my opinion, it still looks great now. Actually, in my opinion, it looks better than the current YZ250 does. I really love this bodywork. Good looking machine that's really stood the test of time. And if you consider how long ago this was, it's pretty remarkable that it still looks so good. This new tank is more compact. The seat is flatter here for 2002. The foot pegs are lower and the handlebars are moved 5 millimeters forward. This was all done to give the machine a roomier layout. And as I said, the previous design was considered a little bit compact for some people. Here for 2002, they made changes to, I guess, make the YZ fit a wider variety of body shapes. On the suspension front, there's some minor updates here in 2002. You get a new rear Kayaba shock that's lengthened slightly to meet up with the new linkage for 2002. The pivot shaft within the linkage was increased in size from 17 to 18 millimeters to help with torsional flex here in 2002. And the swing arm's taper was refined to save weight. The Kayaba forks got some few minor changes here in 2002. The biggest being a new two-piece piston, which helps smooth out the flow within the compression and rebound stroke, allowing the bike to sit up higher for improved handling. The front end also got a new race team inspired front hub. The motor changes were pretty minor here in 2002. You get a new shape for the Yamaha power valve system. You also get a new carbon fiber reed valve and a slight change to the intake to increase velocity. The kickshaft diameter was changed by 2 millimeters here in 2002 to save weight, and you get an all-new exhaust pipe to match the new low boy layout of the tank. The overall ergonomics, as I said, are more roomy here with a flatter seat, a little more room. In addition to the smaller tank, you get all new side plates here, which have a larger surface area for more numbers, and you have a redesigned airbox, which is no longer white. I love this design. As I said, it's a really good looking motorcycle, and this is pretty much unanimously the best machine available in 2002. Honda redesigned their CR250 here in 2002, and it was improved in every way but one. The all-new chassis and suspension were excellent, really an improvement in terms of the second generation frame, but they moved to a case reed here in 2002, and that really handicapped the Honda in the final standings. That motor didn't have the snap and the response of the Yamaha. And this YZ250 motor was really kind of coming into its own. Yamaha was hitting on all cylinders here in 2002, and they easily built the best 250 available at the time. It was a great motorcycle that was pretty much a unanimous pick as the best 250 in the land here in 2002. Here for 2003, you get a minor list of updates to the YZ250. At this point, all the manufacturers were still pumping technology into the 250 two-strokes. Four-strokes were coming online. Honda had introduced their CRF 450 in 2002. Yamaha, of course, had their YZ 400, 426, and now YZ 450 here for 2003. So there was some division of the technology, but there was still a fair amount of technology being shared between the 450 and the 250. And in 2003, the YZ250 was still getting all the latest stuff at this point. Here this year you get an update to the Kayaba bumper forks. They feature new valving to lessen bottoming, a concave fork cap with an aluminum bleed screw, a hollow damping rod, and the fork stanchions offer less taper for more rigidity. Here this year, you also get some changes to the porting and a slight reduction in the cylinder head volume. The exhaust port was raised 0.4 millimeters for more top end, and the upper corners of the exhaust port have a tighter radius for more port area. The taper on the crankshaft was also slightly changed here in 2003. Second gear was made slightly taller and closer to third gear here for 2003. Second and fourth gears have also been widened by 1 millimeter for more strength. Yamaha dropped the paint from the 2003 swing arm and anodized it instead. Additionally, the axle blocks are smaller and slightly lighter here in 2003. Weight savings were found in the brakes by going to a downsized rear caliper, which is smaller and more rigid, with 5% smaller brake pads to go along with it. They also integrated the rear master cylinder, which saved 45 grams, and added a 14-gram lighter rear brake caliper guard. A new lighter weight aluminum piston is also added to the front brake to save weight. On the rear suspension front, the shock spring is 8 ounces lighter thanks to a lighter grade of spring steel, and the body of the shock is 40 grams lighter by switching from brass and steel parts to aluminum in 2003. On the track, this is the unanimous choice for the best 250. Some of the shootouts are now including 450s in them, and that kind of muddles things a bit. The 450 is just hard to beat in terms of power and overall performance, but if you're looking for a two-stroke, the YZ was pretty much pick of the litter here in 2003, although I will say that the RM250 is starting to nip at its heels a bit. In 2001, the RM250 was all new, but just like the 96 redesign on the Yamaha, it would take a few seasons for Suzuki to get the most out of its new platform. And by 2003, that Suzuki was getting much better. The Yamaha wasn't changing a whole lot year over year, but it seems like most of the magazines still think it's the best machine available here in 2003. For 2004, the YZ250 gets a minor list of updates. The most significant of those is an all-new fork, which ups the diameter from 46 millimeters to 48 millimeters. This new 48 millimeter Kayaba fork has a hydraulic bottoming system, so it's an all-new design internally. You also get the addition of a grippier seat here in 2004, which is certainly nice if you're trying to keep from sliding off the back of the machine under acceleration. You get new titanium foot pegs, which were a really cool addition. Certainly those would have cost you a couple $100 if you were to buy them in the aftermarket and add it to the machine. To go along with the new larger forks, of course, you get a new triple clamps to accommodate the larger diameter forks. The front brake guide is slightly changed here for 2004. You also get an additional steel cap on the power valve for durability and a new aluminum exhaust bracket. Really, other than that, there's not much in the way of changes here. The YZ250 was easily one of the most competitive machines, but this year you get a bit of a challenge from Suzuki and Motocross Action Dirt Bike. Both picked the RM as the more fun to ride machine here in 2004 and picked it over the YZ overall. The Yamaha, as I said, had the broadest power, but Suzuki was really coming out with a really snappy, hard-hitting engine. I had one of these RMs in this era, and it was very fast. I personally like the Yamaha motors better. I thought they were easier to ride, but the RM certainly was fun. And depending on what you were looking for, the RM had, better turning and a more exciting delivery, although, like I said, not necessarily easier to ride. Overall, though, this continues to be certainly one of the best machines in the class here in 2004, despite a year of very minor improvements. All right, here for 2005, we get one of the last and most significant updates the YZ250 would see with an all-new alloy frame. Honda, of course, had introduced the first aluminum motocrosser production side anyway in 97, and they had a lot of teething problems here. It took them, 5 or 6 years to kind of figure it out, and Yamaha clearly was looking at what Honda was doing. Interestingly, though, this is not a perimeter frame. The YZs, even the 450 later when it went to the aluminum frame, did not use this perimeter design. They certainly weren't copying Honda in the way Kawasaki and Suzuki tended to when they came out with their alloy chassis. This is essentially the same style of frame the YZ250 had in steel, just in a new aluminum construction, which is certainly unique and very interesting. I thought this looked really cool, the way it's kind of those little hollowed out sections and stuff. I thought it was super trick in 2005. I actually bought one of these YZ250s. I had a 2005, and I really loved it. It was a great machine. I will say, personally, I didn't really jive with the suspension this year, but the motor was great, and the handling I thought was great. Here, this new chassis does save a good bit of weight. The frame itself is 4 pounds lighter by going to aluminum, and the complete machine is 7.5 pounds lighter for 2005. So that is a significant drop in weight. Here this year, you get a 48 millimeter Kayaba fork that's new, same size as last year, but they went to the AOSS, which stood for the air oil separation system on the Kayaba design. I guess it's similar to what Showa had been doing with their twin chamber design. It allowed the air to stay separate from the oil to keep them from frothing and contaminating and thus degrading performance. Here in 2005, you also get the long-awaited debut of a Honda-style routing for the brake. Previous to this, I think Honda reportedly had a patent on the direct routing, so they had to kind of go underneath the forks on these upside-down fork designs. But for 2005, they got around that somehow. I don't know if the patent wore out or what exactly happened there, but they went with a more direct design. So the brake line is significantly shorter, which improved feel and also made bleeding somewhat easier as well. The triple clamp is new this year. It's slightly lighter. The plastic formula, Yamaha claims, even though it looks the same, is a little different this year to reduce the streaking, those white creases you get if you bend the plastic. I never had any trouble with my 2005, so maybe it worked, I don't know. But certainly they say it's better, so we'll take their word for it. Here in 2005, you get Rinthal aluminum bars as standard equipment. That was something nice that the Austrians had for a while. They were the first ones to kind of go with an alloy bar, the European designs. And here in 2005, Yamaha finally gets Rinthal bars as standard equipment, which was certainly a nice upgrade. The swing arm is slightly different here for this year. It is made of all new castings, and Yamaha lopped 1.1 pounds of weight off the swing arm here for 2005. And the shock was slightly redone with a new oil lockout, which apparently was supposed to work better when the shock topped out. The piston was 3 grams heavier than in 2004, and that was done to increase reliability slightly. Front number plate is the same design overall, but it is crafted out of white this year, so you don't have to worry about putting a white background on your blue number plate. Overall, as I said, the weight was less. The new bike came in at 217 pounds versus the 224.5 pounds of the 2004 YZ250. Motor changes were negligible for this year. They really didn't make any changes at all. That's not a bad thing necessarily, because obviously the engine was very well regarded. In terms of overall performance, this is a very well liked machine, but it's still losing in most of the shootouts to Suzuki. The Suzuki is kind of on a roll at this point, but they're really right neck and neck, 1-2. I think it's kind of just what your preference was as to how they ran. As I said, I didn't really like the suspension this year. I kind of thought it was a little bit harsh. Personally, certainly not as good as the suspension on some of the later YZs. I had an 09 450, and they went with the SSS fork a little bit after this. It was an improvement in terms of overall performance, but magazines don't seem to have too much of an issue with it. Obviously, suspension's up to each individual person to decide, but overall, I thought this was a really fun machine, great engine, awesome fun bike, and I liked it a lot better than the RM. My YZ was a 05, my RM was an 06, and I just felt way more comfortable on the Yamaha personally. But of course, that's a independent thing, and that's just my opinion. But I think the magazines were pretty evenly split on which one was a better bike at this time. The 2006 season was a big one at Yamaha, but unfortunately, most of that excitement was in the 4-stroke divisions. This year, you get an all-new YZ250F and 450F with the introduction of an all-new alloy chassis, which interestingly bore absolutely no resemblance to the alloy chassis found on the YZ250 and 125. All their big bikes have alloy chassis, but they're completely different designs here, which again is a very interesting choice by Yamaha. Now this year, you do get some improvements on the YZ250 though. It has all new suspension front and rear. The chassis, the frame, the engine, all that's identical to the year before. The only difference is in the plastic is you have a slight revision to the front number plate and the front fender. Other than that, all the bodywork is identical. But as I said, you do get all new suspension. This year, they ditched the AOSS fork after only 1 year and went with an all-new speed-sensitive SSS Kayaba fork. This fork is well known as probably the best fork in motocross for the next 10-15 years. It is an excellent design. Yamaha stuck with it even during the time when everybody was going with air forks, and it is a huge step forward in terms of performance over the old AOSS design. As I said, that was the only thing I really didn't like about my 05. If I'd had the 06, I think overall it was a much better bike just for the forks alone. This year you also get a redesign to the rear shock. The new shock steals some technology off of Chad Reed's Works bike, and then it gets an 18mm shock shaft, which is 2mm larger than the old one. It also gets all new internals with a Kashima coating to reduce friction, and a larger reservoir by 30% to help fight fade. And last but not least, you get a titanium shock spring, which is a super trick on the YZ250 here for 2006. Other than that, there really isn't much in the way of changes here. The suspension, as I said, is completely upgraded, but the rest of the machine is identical to the year before. Thankfully, though, that suspension upgrade was a substantial improvement. The motor runs exactly the same flexible, broad power it had always had, and this year they added much better suspension. So it's a really great platform overall, an awesome motorcycle, in spite of the fact that a lot of people were already kind of defecting to the 4-strokes. The 4-strokes were clearly becoming the focus of all the Japanese manufacturers moving forward. But it's nice to see that here in 2006, Yamaha was still putting some money into the YZ250. And it is certainly, if you're looking for a 2-stroke, it was probably the best machine to buy here in 2006. The 2007 season is a significant one in the case of the YZ250 in that this is the last year where the quote-unquote Big Four do battle in the 250 stroke class. Unfortunately, Honda, Kawasaki, and Suzuki were all getting ready to retire their 252 strokes, much to my chagrin and the chagrin of many others. This year, they don't make a whole lot of changes to the YZ250, but there are a few updates. Obviously, the graphics are slightly different. I actually don't really like these 07 graphics, particularly. I think the 06 and older were a nicer look, but other than that, they're identical looking on the outside. The bodywork's all exactly the same. They did make a change to the thickness of the inner and outer fork tubes to feed in a bit more flex to the front end of the YZ this year. Additionally, they revised the damping slightly to improve feel and lower the overall weight of the front fork. They made some changes in the Kiaba shock, changing a few components to aluminum to lower the weight as well. They also updated the valving slightly here in 2007. The bars are still aluminum here for 2007, but they went from a 7/8 inch Rinthal bar to a 1 1/8 inch Pro Taper contour bar, which is a nice upgrade here for 2007. They also updated the carburetor with a new needle here for the 38mm Kaheen mixer, and they changed some of the bolts to be a little lighter throughout the chassis. All in, it added up to a 1 pound reduction in weight over 2006. Certainly not groundbreaking changes, but welcome. At this point, I think any change in a 250 two-stroke was probably welcome to those of us who are kind of hanging on to the two-stroke love there. Despite not having any radical updates, it is still one of the best machines available. Motocross Action picked it as the best two-stroke this year. They're kind of going back and forth year to year whether the RM or the YZ was number one. There wasn't a whole lot of changes on either one this year, but this year the Yamaha won out. Overall, I don't think you go wrong with either one. They're both great machines. Obviously, I would love to have seen them do a little more development, but moving forward, there weren't going to be a whole lot of radical changes to the YZ platform. Here for 2008, the YZ250 is back with not a whole lot of changes. This is kind of getting to the era like the 500s were toward the end, where sometimes they get some of the trickle down. So if they redesigned the suspension on the 450, the 250 would get that update as well. But they weren't going to invest a ton of money in the YZ250 moving forward, unfortunately. Here in 08, you do get all new forks across the line on the YZs. They actually shortened the tubes by 4mm. They added a smaller oil lock piston, new compression valve ports, and stiffer springs on the YZ250. They also added some cool new brake rotors, which had a wave pattern to them, which was cool looking. Don't know if it actually worked better, but it did look cool. You actually have a new master cylinder and revised calipers here in 2008 as well to go with bold new graphics. Other than that, the machine is exactly the same as the year before and still a very good 250 in a much smaller class here in 2008. For 2009, the good news is the YZ250 is still in production. The bad news is there's not a whole lot of updates to the machine. I guess that's kind of a good and a bad thing because the bike was great to begin with, but that being said, they didn't do a whole lot here to update it here in 2009. There are no changes to the chassis whatsoever. Even compared to the 08 updates, this is pretty minimal. You get a new texture to the seat cover, some updated bold new graphics, a new lighter aluminum front hose clamp, and they added a new chain, which was gold colored. This DID chain apparently was coated to improve rust resistance and looks. The machine, other than that, is identical to the year before. Still a great bike, but nothing groundbreaking here in 2009. For 2010, we've officially entered the bold new graphics era of the YZ250's lifespan. By this point, none of the other Japanese manufacturers are building 252 strokes anymore, which is quite sad. But that being said, KTM was developing their KTM 250. I had bought a brand new KTM 250 in 2008. And I will say, comparing it to the YZs and the other Japanese bikes I had at this time, it was still a step behind. I will say the motor was quite good on that KTM, but the chassis and the suspension were definitely not as good, certainly on a motocross track. I mostly rode my KTM in the woods. It was great for that. It was fine. On a motocross track, when I took it out there, it just felt a little sketchy at times. I never felt really comfortable with the way it handled. It would kind of head shake suddenly on me and kind of scare the crap out of me every now and again. But overall, it was definitely a good bike, but not quite as refined as this Yamaha. Yamaha really didn't need to pour a ton of money into it with all their competitors pulling out. So I guess at least they were still building it. But here for 2010, you don't get anything other than some new graphics on the right and left-hand radiator shroud. For 2011, the YZ250 was back with actually a few updates. This year they went to a global spec on the YZ250. What that meant was you no longer had different versions in the US that you got in Europe and Japan. What that meant for us was we got a slightly longer silencer, 75mm longer to be exact. This was a quieter version of the silencer. I'm assuming the FIM had different standards for sound, so they went with a longer silencer. It probably saved them a little bit of money as opposed to having different versions for different markets. There's also a larger diameter perforated core inside and increased packing volume. The compression was slightly lowered here from 10.9 to 1 to 10.6 to 1 by increasing the combustion chamber volume by 0.5 cc's. This was done to allow the bike to run on a wider range of fuel globally. Again, you're talking about having a machine that's going to be the same spec here and in Europe, where I'm sure the fuel was probably different formulation over there than here. The jetting was also revised to match the new silencer and lower compression. Other than that, the YZ is identical to the year before, aside of course from the new graphics for 2011. For 2012, there are no exciting new changes on the YZ250, just a set of not really bold new graphics here for the shrouds and tank. I will say at the time, I hated the styling of the four-stroke Yamahas, the 2010 and forward. They went to the reverse motor, thought it was a really strange looking motorcycle. Even the YZ250F at the time had some really angular bodywork. This older style, this bodywork at this point goes back to 2002. And I still think it looks great, personally. So actually, I think the YZ250, ironically, was better off for the lack of changes in terms of aesthetics, at least. Other than that, it's the exact same machine it was in 2011. For 2013, the YZ250 is back with an exciting retro update, a white rear fender. This is a throwback to the 97 design, which I actually didn't really care for in 97. Don't really care for it too much here. Obviously, they're not going to throw a lot of money at this. So I suppose the best they could come up with was a new fender here for 2013. You do have some updated graphics. The graphics don't look bad. Overall, it's a good looking motorcycle still, but unfortunately, nothing exciting here on the YZ250 landscape for 2013. For 2014, the YZ250 was back with only bold new graphics. This year, they didn't even update the rear fender. It's still white. They could have gone with magenta or something exciting, but they kept it white. Other than that, the bike's exactly the same as the year before. Yamaha at least kept the YZ250 in its lineup, so you have to give them credit for that for sure. Big news for 2015, we get some significant updates on the YZ250. Yamaha threw some money at the machine this year with all new bodywork. Personally, I'm not the biggest fan of this look. It's reminiscent of their angular styling on their 250 four-stroke at the time. But that being said, I know a lot of people like the fact that they at least put some money towards it, updated the styling. Overall, I prefer the old bodywork, but it's definitely new and gives the bike an updated look. It's certainly more angular, as I said. The side panels are more modern looking. There's a nice integration of the side plate and the airbox. Overall, certainly it's an updated look that was probably a welcome change to many. Other than that, the main significant update here is some changes to the fork. It still uses the SSS Kayaba fork. Yamaha kept with a spring fork that was really well dialed, and this fork is excellent. Here for 2015, you get an update to the tubes themselves. They updated the wall thickness to be more resilient. They also made new valving and updated the springs as well. Other than that, there's not a whole lot to change. They did update the clutch perch as well to make it adjustable for reach, which is nice. Overall, this is easily the most significant update to the YZ in a decade and a welcome change here in 2015. For 2016, the YZ250 was back with only a slight update to its overall look and performance. You do get some black rims this year. That's a love it or hate it thing. Certainly when you go to change the tires, I hate it because it's easy to scuff them, but it does give the machine a kind of a modern look. You have revised suspension front and rear. They updated the valving slightly here for 2016. The nice thing is the four strokes and the two strokes use a lot of the same components, so if they updated one as far as suspension goes, a lot of times the two stroke would get the same benefit. The bike is unchanged other than that. One nice thing to mention this year is the availability of a new model. For 2016, Yamaha brought out a YZ250X, which is a direct successor to the original YZ250WR back in the early 90s. A great off-road machine. This thing is basically a YZ250 with a kickstand, an 18-inch wheel, and a few minor changes to the transmission, O-ring chain, stuff like that. It's not a straight-up enduro machine, kind of like the old RMXs where it's not choked off or anything. It's basically like the original WR was, which is basically a motocrosser with the minor few changes to get it ready for off-road use. And at only $100 more than the YZ250, it was a pretty good deal, actually, in my opinion. It was cool of Yamaha to be supporting the two-strokes and bringing out additional models, which was something certainly none of the other Japanese were doing at the time. For 2017, we don't get any serious updates, but we do get a minor change. You have updated graphics, of course, which is a yearly thing, but you also do get an upgrade to the front brake. Here for 2017, they moved to a 270mm front brake, and they also added new pad material for superior stopping performance. This was again something that was coming from the four strokes, so the YZ250 did get the benefit of the upgrading braking here in 2017. For those amongst us who are rim obsessed, the 2018 YZ250 is an exciting update. This year, they moved from black rims to blue. Personally, I never thought the blue rims were a great look, but again, might be floating your boat. Other than that, there's nothing changed other than some bold new graphics for the tank and shrouds. I'm not sure this is a huge cosmetic upgrade, but your mileage may vary on that. 2019 is another year without any significant updates for the YZ250. This year they maintained the blue rims and added some updated graphics. I do like these graphics slightly better than the year before, but it's not a significant change really overall. The YZ250 was back again for 2020. This time, once again, it's just a set of new graphics. No other updates, minor or otherwise, to the bike, just the new graphics here for 2020. For 2021, Yamaha dialed up a purely cosmetic update, but I actually think it's a significant improvement, at least in my eyes. I love this new bodywork. It is all blue. The side plates are blue. The front number plate's blue. They switched the front fork guards from white to black. And overall, I think it really works. The new graphics have a little more black in them, and they match nicely with the little black panel on the seat cover. I think it's a really good looking motorcycle. This is by far my favorite year so far of the new bodywork. Again, I wasn't a huge fan of the overall design, but I think when you do it all in blue like this with the black accents, it actually looks pretty damn good. This is by far my favorite in terms of the appearance of these. Other than that, there's no mechanical updates here for 2021. It's purely a cosmetic update, but at least in my opinion, it is a significant upgrade in terms of the looks of the standard YZ this year. Hallelujah and bless Bob Hanna. For 2022, we get a serious upgrade to the YZ250. This year, Yamaha introduced all new bodywork that moved away from the angular design introduced in 2015. This is a significant update in terms of the ergonomics of the machine as well as the appearance. You get an all new tank, all new seat, all new rear section, redesigned side panels. There's an all new subframe that allowed a straighter intake track with the new airbox. A significant update. This bike is certainly mechanically very similar to the year before. They didn't update the motor or the chassis to any great extent, but it does have a few hand-me-downs from the 4-strokes as well this year. You get new fork internals that offer revised valving and a new mid-valve shared with the 450. You also have a upgrade to the brakes this year. In 2021, the YZ450 got some new brakes, and for 2022, the 2-stroke version gets an upgrade as well. There's not a huge difference, as I said, mechanically speaking, but certainly in terms of appearance, it is a big difference. In addition to the standard blue YZ, you could actually get a Monster Energy version this year as well if you're into the black thing. Personally, I'm not a huge fan of the black plastic in that it shows wear really badly. Looks crappy after about a month of ownership, but if you did want a YZ that had a little different look to it, at least you could opt for that in 2022. So it was real nice that they were putting the money into the 252 stroke, showing their commitment to it, with support for different versions if you wanted your YZ to have a little different look than everybody else. For 2023, the YZ250 was back with only minor cosmetic updates. There was a small change to the graphics. Other than that, it's exactly the same bike it was in 2022. Still a very excellent machine. Maybe not the most cutting edge, but at this point, certainly KTM was ahead of it in terms of that. They were, 7 to 10 pounds lighter. At this point, KTM was pulling pretty far ahead in terms of technology. The Yamaha still had a competitive motor, but it was a little bit down on power, certainly down on features. The KTM was lighter. They were adding things like electric start and stuff, fuel injection to their 252 strokes that the Yamaha wasn't getting, but not everybody needed the latest technology. Certainly if you're looking for a 252 stroke, you probably aren't at the upper echelon of racing at this point. So considering what the bike was designed for, I think this 23 wasn't still an excellent motorcycle in most minds. On the mechanical front, there's nothing new to talk about here in 2024, but we do have some exciting news on the cosmetic front. Here for 2024, you could get your YZ250 in the classic blue, or you can go for the awesome 2024 50th anniversary edition. This is a really cool throwback to the 1993 YZ250. When they'd come out with their other anniversary edition bikes in 2006, only the 4-strokes got the awesome yellow and black treatment. I loved them at the time. And it's really great that Yamaha included the 2-strokes here in 2024. My only beef with this is the fact that the rims should be silver, not black. That was definitely not 1993 appropriate. But other than that, it's a really cool design. I think it looks great on the bike. And if I was getting a YZ250 in 2024, I definitely would have opted for this over the regular blue. Yamaha's great about offering a couple different cosmetic versions of their bike, and I really appreciate the fact that they included the YZ250 in this anniversary edition in 2024. Here for 2025, you get a nice little update to the YZ250 platform. This year, once again, you can get a Monster Energy version if you prefer your YZ in black to go with the standard blue. In addition to the cosmetic updates, there are some subtle ergonomic and mechanical improvements as well. This year, they went with a new radiator. It was 50 millimeters narrower. In addition to the narrower profile radiators, they also redid the fuel tank to be 6 millimeters narrower, and the seat is 5 millimeters taller, giving it a flatter layout. The foot pegs are also 5 millimeters farther back and 5 millimeters lower. This gives the machine a more roomy layout here for 2025. The forks are updated as well with a new compression adjuster that allows for the compression to be adjusted without tools. So if you wanted to make an adjustment without running back to the truck to get a screwdriver, that was a nice update here for 2025. Other than those minor updates, there's not a whole lot they changed during 25, but it's nice that Yamaha is still putting some money into updating the platform. All right, my moto friends, we have reached the end of our look back at the YZ250 with the 2026 YZ250. Mechanically speaking, there are no updates this year for 26, but there is a cosmetic update that is, for my money, one of the best looking of all the YZs ever. I love this design. The 70th anniversary version is a throwback to the international looking Yamahas of the 70s and 80s, as well as Doug Henry's Works YZM 400. It looks awesome in my opinion. I always loved this iconic white and red look the international bikes had. Always gave it a little more of an exotic flair when we had the yellow ones here. And I think it's a fitting tribute to the YZ lineup. I think this works really well with the overall bodywork of this new YZ design. The shrouds and the graphics all work together really well. The red seat, it's just a great looking motorcycle. If I was going to get one of the new YZs, I would definitely take this one. I even like it better than the 50th anniversary version, which looked like the 93. This is definitely the one to get in my opinion, and a great looking machine. Hopefully Yamaha will keep pumping R&D into the YZ250, and this machine will only continue to get better over the years. So there you have it. That's a look back at the history of Yamaha's YZ250 from 1974 through 2026. Certainly there's a lot of information in this video, a lot of stuff to cover. I'm sure I've missed some things. If I've got anything wrong, feel free to leave me a comment in the comment section below. I'm happy to put an addendum in there in the video if necessary. Like I said, I don't claim to be the know-all, be-all. I try to do the best I could to do some research here, but I'm sure I probably missed some information over the time. If you stuck with it to the end, I really appreciate that. I know, like I said, this is a long video. So if you like this sort of thing, please feel free to let your friends know on social media. I'd really appreciate it if you share this video out there, as well as liking and subscribing. Until we meet again, this is Tony Blazier for the Motocross Vault. Keep the rubber side down. Peace.